The Parliament will have the opportunity to debate a full motion of condolence later this month when his family will be able to join members in paying a fitting tribute to Sir Alex. But I wonder, given that this is our first sitting since his death, would members and all members in the gallery too, in the public gallery, please join me in holding a minute's silence for Sir Alex Ferguson. Thank you, colleagues, and I'm sure members will wish to add their note of commemoration in the book, which is currently in the garden lobby in Sir Alex's name. Now, moving to our first item of business today is consideration of Business Motion 13658 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to say so now? And I call on Graham Day to move the motion.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And you'll be pleased to hear no one's asked to speak against the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 13658 is agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item of business is topical questions. And we'll start with question number 1 from Daniel Johnson.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the integration of British Transport Police and Police Scotland. Cabinet
Secretary Hamza Youssef.
Throughout the re-planning process commissioned by Scottish Ministers, we have committed to listening to stakeholders. As part of that re-plan, recent advice from Police Scotland on a range of issues and the timing of implementation, particularly on realignment of ICT, has emerged. Based on that information, I've decided that we will re-examine all options for the devolution of railway policing with clear governance structures that ensure accountability to the Scottish Parliament. Full integration of railway policing into Police Scotland as legislated for by the Scottish Parliament remains a long-term goal, and we will keep that commencement date of the Act under review. However, there is clearly a need to identify interim arrangements that can give effect more quickly to the Smith Commission's cross-party recommendation to devolve railway policing to the Scottish Parliament. The absolute priority for all of those involved is the safety and security of officers, staff and, of course, those who use Scotland's railways. I want to pay tribute to the ongoing commitment of officers and staff of both police services who I look forward to engaging with on this matter in the very near future. I will commit, of course, to keep Parliament fully updated on progress.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank the Minister for that response. Indeed, I also welcome him to his position and I look forward to our future exchanges as the new Cabinet Secretary. And I believe the Cabinet Secretary deserves credit for listening to experts, unions and officers and reviewing the future of devolution of railway policing. However, if he was really listening, he would know that full integration is not possible, or at the very least that both its cost and timescales are a complete mystery, because that was the message from the SPA board meeting last week. So in his review, will he not just put off full integration on an interim basis, but rule it out altogether?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I say, the current priority, the immediate priority, is to find interim arrangements where we, I think, have cross-party concerns around, for example, the accountability or lack thereof to this Parliament of British Transport Police, and that's something that has to be rectified. So that is the immediate priority. And as I say, the long-term goal would be to keep full integration under review. I think that is a sensible thing to do because there are benefits of full integration, which again came out in evidence sessions during the debate and from evidence of stakeholders. For example, such things as a single command structure and so on and so forth. But that, frankly, is not the immediate priority. The immediate priority, in order to give certainty, of course, to staff, to officers and others, and to, of course, very importantly, ensure that there is accountability and democratic accountability of BTP, is to come to some interim solutions. And what I would say in that respect is my door will be very open to stakeholders, but also, I should say, to all members of the opposition to engage and to listen to those ideas that might well come forward from across the chamber.
The Cabinet Secretary knows that if there was a viable route forward for full integration, it would have been found by now. 2 years on, and we are no closer to knowing the costs or the timescales to make this happen. And a 2-month review is simply not going to find an answer in that time. So does the Cabinet Secretary not recognise that as long as full integration remains on the table, there remains a great uncertainty for officers and staff? And if he does, is it not true that, and that the conclusion of his review is inevitable, that all he is doing is prolonging the uncertainty, which is ultimately unnecessary?
No, I disagree with his analysis for a couple of reasons. One is that the review that we'll be undertaking, the engagement we'll be having with stakeholders, will not be focused on finding a timetable and a timeline for full integration. It will be in and around what will be the other options that we can explore to give effect to the Smith Commission's cross-party recommendations of the devolution of railway policing to Scotland. So that will be the purpose of that engagement. In terms of full integration, as I say, that remains a long-term goal which will be kept under review. So therefore, if he is right, those that oppose full integration are right, as I say, that is something that will be kept under review. It is not the immediate priority. The immediate priority is to find other options that will give effect to the Smith Commission. But I would give him that challenge, and he and I spoke when I was put into position in my first week in the role, that he knows my approach is one where I'll look for good ideas wherever they come from across the chamber. So I look forward to hearing his proposals on the other options to give effect to the Smith Commission's recommendations.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Will the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the Commission service model, which he previously opposed, is now very much on the table?
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't want to prejudge the engagement that I'm about to have with stakeholders. Some of that engagement is being taken forward today between officials and stakeholders and over tomorrow, and I will engage personally, of course, with stakeholders too. But certainly we should be looking for good ideas from wherever they come from. I know the Commission model. There were some reservations around the Commission model, and I think they are legitimate to express. But you know, I don't want to prejudge that, but certainly we will be looking and re-examining all of the options that have been considered before, but also if there are other options that haven't been considered before to be brought forward and to be examined as part of this process.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. Can I also join in congratulating the Cabinet Secretary on his new appointment? Does he not, though, now regret rejecting the amendment I lodged at stage 3 to delay the implementation of this merger at the very least? Will he give an assurance to this Parliament that detailed business plans will be developed on any options that are being consulted upon, that Parliament will have a role in determining how we go forward, given that the Chief Constable of Police Scotland has made clear his views in relation to the risk to public safety of pressing ahead with merger?
Cabinet Secretary.
That's a point that Liam MacArthur is exceptionally important. We are, of course, I have made this decision based on the advice from Police Scotland. It would be foolish of me to have ignored that advice in terms of their concerns around ICT alignment and so on and so forth. And I think that is important to keep at the heart very much of this. In terms of his other asks around business cases and so on and so forth, yes, whatever option we come forward with, and that will be with a consultation with stakeholders. Of course, I think it's important to give as much confidence around that model that we choose to explore. So I'll be happy to commit to ensuring there is as much scrutiny of that option and as much transparency of that option to this Parliament as possible.
Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Scottish Government remain committed to working fully with stakeholders as they have done so far?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, of course, I will look to do that, even for those that, of course, very much so with those that have been in opposition to full integration, but also for those across the Chamber. It's certainly worth keeping that engagement going, but clearly already from the announcement of my announcement of re-examining the options, I've already had a number of organisations come to me saying that they want to engage. So my door will be very much open to that engagement, and I look forward to seeing what that engagement concludes in terms of the process moving forward.
And John Finney.
Thank you, President Officer. The Cabinet Secretaries failed to address legitimate and ongoing concerns of BT officers and staff. Can the Cabinet Secretary detail what role that failure has played in his failure to deliver on the will of Parliament on this important issue?
Cabinet Secretary.
But, you know, if I had gone against Police Scotland's advice to me around the difficulties of getting a timescale and a timeline for full integration, particularly the primaries concern around ICT, but other concerns too, I don't doubt that John Finney would probably be the first one to pull me up in front of this Parliament to say that we had gone against Police Scotland's advice. You know, he will have to accept, as I have done, over a period of reflection early on in this role, that although that was the intention of the government, full integration, and the will of the Parliament, supported by his party, it would be foolish, really foolish, to have ignored Police Scotland's advice. I'm more than happy, of course, to speak to John Finney, as I would with any other member, in more detail around some of their concerns. But the path that I've chosen to go down is very much based on the advice that Police Scotland have given me, and in terms of giving more certainty to officers and staff in BTP. As I said, as sooner we can get on with examining the other options for devolution of railway policing in Scotland, the better.
Thank you. Question number 2, Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions this has had with ScotRail and South Ayrshire Council regarding the implemented exclusion zone around Ayr Railway Station, which is causing disruption for many passengers, including those travelling south of Ayr to Girvan and Stranraer.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
I discussed the situation with the Leader and Chief Executive of South Ayrshire Council last week. Transport Scotland officials have engaged with senior officials at both the ScotRail Alliance and South Ayrshire Council on several occasions since the exclusion zone at Ayr Station has affected Platform 3 and 4. Additionally, Transport Scotland established a new task force, including other relevant directorates from the Scottish Government, to support South Ayrshire Council in identifying solutions to the immediate safety concerns. The key objective is to ensure that a full rail service can be restored safely as soon as possible, but also that any long-term solutions contributes to the economic prosperity of the town centre and other affected areas.
Emma Harper.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The Ayr Station Hotel and the railway building is a structure majority owned by a Malaysian businessman, Mr Ung, along with Network Rail. My understanding is that Mr Ung has refused to engage with South Ayrshire Council to work to make this structure safe, which has resulted in Platform 3 and 4 being closed altogether. This means trains are unable to run between Ayr, Maybole, Girvan and Stranraer. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what, if any, action the Scottish Government can take to make Mr Ung accountable for one of his many UK properties?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I recognise the significant disruption this platform closure is causing to Ayr Station and to a number of the other stations, particularly Maybole, Girvan and Stranraer. As it stands, the Scottish Government has no powers to take action against the owner of this building. Local authority, though, has powers under the Building Scotland Act 2003 to take action on owners where their building has become dangerous or fallen into a state of disrepair. South Ayrshire Council have used these powers to serve a dangerous buildings notice and are currently working to make the building safe and to allow the platforms to reopen as soon as possible. The member will appreciate building owners are ultimately responsible for the upkeep and safety of the buildings they own.
Emma Harper.
Again, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. I have also had many constituents contact me regarding the disruption, including one young constituent in Stranraer not being able to get the train to university and others being unable to get to work. Can the Cabinet Secretary therefore give a commitment that the Scottish Government will ensure appropriate alternative transport links are put in place and indeed monitored while the situation with Ayr Station is ongoing?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I can give the member that assurance because ScotRail are presently providing a replacement bus for rail passengers wishing to travel from Ayr onto Stranraer, passengers wishing to travel to Stranraer from Kilmarnock and vice versa are also being provided with a taxi to and from Ayr Station and for onward travel by bus. And ScotRail will continue to keep it under review to see whether there's any further action they can take in order to try and reduce the inconvenience to the travelling public.
John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister is well aware of the much reduced rail service between Ayr and Glasgow, which affects my constituents in Ayr, Prestwick and Troon and many others on the Ayr to Glasgow rail line. While I appreciate that circumstances can't change or different options be taken before a structural engineer's report is produced, can the Minister tell Parliament when this report will be produced and what his plans are for the services on this line if the station hotel at Ayr has to be demolished? If, on the other hand, the building can be saved, what support can the Scottish Government give to restoring or redeveloping the station hotel in Ayr?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, ScotRail are continuing to keep the present emergency timetable in place under review to look at whether there are further measures they can take in order to address some of the issues, particularly around some of the issues around the number of people who are trying to use the service as it moves towards Glasgow Central, particularly around the Paisley area, whether they can add additional carriages at a later stage. What I can also assure the member is that the responsibility here for the decision to apply an exclusion zone is for the local authority. And any change to that exclusion zone is a matter for the local authority. The assistance that the task force is providing is to ensure that appropriate measures are put in place to identify what action could be taken in order to reduce that exclusion zone. That work is ongoing at the present moment with engineers. Once South Ayrshire Council have that report, they will share that with the task force to look at what action can then be taken in order to make sure that any measures that can be implemented are taken forward as quickly as possible. We will continue to support South Ayrshire Council in addressing these issues. So we're providing with legal advice and also buildings advice from our experts within the Scottish Government, so that they understand all of the responsibilities and the actions that they can take. But this report from engineers will allow us to then make a decision on whether the exclusion zone can then be reduced, and that will be a matter for South Ayrshire Council, but we will support them and provide them with what assistance we can to take that action forward once the report's been completed.
Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In April, I chaired a public meeting in Ayr Town Hall organised by local campaigner Esther Clark, packed out by residents frustrated at the demise of Ayr Station Hotel. Does the Cabinet Secretary understand the anger in the community at the utter neglect of the former hotel? And will the Scottish Government take action not only to ensure that the building is made safe so we can end the current rail chaos, but actually put in place a long-term plan to bring this historic building back into use for the benefit of the local community?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as a member will appreciate, the responsibility for the condition of the building lies with the private owner of this particular building, who has clearly neglected it over a very extended period of time. And I do recognise that South Ayrshire Council have also taken action to try and address these issues earlier in the course of the year, without the success of engaging effectively with the owner of the building. As I just mentioned to John Scott, the decision to apply an exclusion zone is the responsibility of the local authority. The plans that they then have for the use of that building, working with the owner and the wider town centre redevelopment, is a matter for South Ayrshire Council. What we are providing them with is the support and assistance that they require in order to make sure that we understand what action can be taken to reduce the exclusion zone, to get the platforms reopened, to get the train station operating back to its normal capacity as soon as possible. Once South Ayrshire have got that report completed and they're able to share that with the task force, they'll be provided with additional support to make sure that action is taken forward as quickly as possible so we can get the station returned to its normal function.
Thank you. Question number 3, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how NHS boards ensure that patients' concerns regarding surgical practices are properly addressed.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. NHS boards have governance and appraisal mechanisms for their clinicians. This includes the boards being responsible for a system of appraisal and job planning for each consultant. In 2017-18, boards implemented the revised NHS complaints procedure, which provides a formal route for patients and their families to raise concerns. The organisational duty of candour legislation came into force in Scotland on the 1st of April this year. The duty of candour legislation also requires organisations to provide an apology to those who have been harmed and to involve them in identifying organisational learning and improvements where necessary.
Murdo Fraser.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response and welcome her to her new role. This week, shocking details relating to the case of the NHS Tayside surgeon, Professor Sam El-Jamel, were disclosed in a BBC investigation. Professor El-Jamel is accused of making a series of mistakes while operating on patients at NHS Tayside. At the time, an external investigation concluded that he was injuring patients, but despite this, he was allowed to continue operating. It does appear that NHS Tayside had neither the audit systems in place to pick up on his mistakes or a decisive senior management team to prevent this from happening. What assurance can the Cabinet Secretary give us that in other Scottish health boards we will not see similar incidents where surgeons are free to operate despite concerns being raised about their abilities?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As I'm sure members will appreciate, there is a degree to which I am limited in what I can express here, but let me be really clear to Mr Fraser and to the Chamber that any instance of harm incurred by any patient in our health service is a matter I take extremely seriously. We have a number of measures in place that boards should be following. It is worth mentioning the globally recognised Scottish Patient Safety Programme, which has had surgical safety as one of its work streams since it began and has led to over a 20% reduction in surgical mortality across Scotland. I have today asked for an assurance from all our health boards, from their chairs and chief executives, a joint assurance that all the steps that this government expects them to be following in terms of compliance with these measures and others are indeed being followed, and our Chief Medical Officer and others will continue to pursue these matters to ensure that we have the best patient safety that we possibly can in this country.
Murdo Fraser.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that full and very helpful response? I don't know if she watched last night's BBC documentary and if, like me, she felt angry and sad for the patients who recounted their personal stories in that. We learned today from the Courier newspaper that Professor El Jamel is still holding himself out as working at Ninewells Hospital, despite the fact his contract there has been severed. In wake of all the new evidence that's coming out, does the Scottish Government accept there is now the case for a fully independent investigation into these issues?
Cabinet Secretary.
What I do accept is, as I said before, that any instance of harm to a patient in our National Health Service is a matter of considerable concern, and I take it very seriously. What I am doing is reviewing the situation with respect to this particular instance and looking more widely across our boards, and in that I will give due consideration to what other further steps we might sensibly take in order to ensure that we have the level of patient safety across Scotland that we aim for and that our statistics currently indicate that we have overall across the NHS.
Thank you very much, and that concludes topical questions. We'll move on now to the next item of business, which is a statement by Nicola Sturgeon on the Scottish Government's Programme for Government 2018-2019. And the First Minister's statement will be followed by a debate, so there should be no interventions or interruptions during the statement. And I call on the First Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last year's Programme for Government set us on a path to address the big challenges faced by Scotland and developed economies around the world. It set out bold plans to tackle inequality, adapt to an ageing population and move to a low-carbon society. And it presented a clear vision of the kind of country we want to be. A nation leading the world in technological innovation and staying true to enduring values of social justice. A country proud of its history and achievements, but equipping itself to seize the opportunities of the future. And a society determined to remain open, inclusive and welcoming in the face of rising forces of intolerance, isolation and protectionism. This Programme for Government today flows from that vision. And it builds on the progress of the last year, indeed of the last decade. And it ensures that we remain focused on delivering for today and investing for tomorrow. It continues and accelerates the major reforms underway in our health, education and justice systems, underpinned, of course, by our new progressive system of income tax. It seeks to make further progress on tackling inequality and reducing poverty. It sets out the next steps in the operation of our new social security system, and it builds on our work to support Scotland's economy and encourage innovation. It does all of this, of course, in the shadow of Brexit. We simply cannot ignore Brexit, or indeed the UK Government's shamefully shambolic handling of these negotiations. For our part, we will continue to make the case for EU membership. Short of that, we will press the UK Government to remain in the single market and the customs union. And as the terms of Brexit become clearer in the months ahead, we will consider and set out our view on how Scotland's interests can best be protected and advanced. Of course, as we saw just yesterday, it is clear that an increasing number of our fellow citizens believe, as we do, that the best future for Scotland lies in becoming an independent country. Presiding Officer, this programme for government will be impacted by Brexit, but it is not defined by it. Instead, it sets out how we intend to deliver on our vision of a healthier, wealthier and fairer Scotland. Let me turn first to the economy. Economic growth in Scotland over the past year has been higher than in the rest of the UK. Exports of goods have increased by 12%, the fastest growth of any UK nation. Youth and women's unemployment are lower than in the UK as a whole. And in the last decade, Scotland has significantly narrowed our productivity gap with the rest of the UK. These are strong foundations, but we must intensify our efforts now to build an economy fit for the future. Last year, we set out a range of bold measures. This year, we will continue to deliver. Firstly, we will ensure that the business environment in Scotland remains competitive and that we are providing the support that business needs to thrive. We have already implemented key recommendations of the Barclay Review on business rates, such as relief for new builds and property improvements and for day nurseries. I can confirm today that we will introduce a non-domestic rates bill to implement its other recommendations, for example, reforming rate reliefs and moving to a 3-year valuation cycle. In the past year, we also established the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board. Drawing on its recommendations, we will publish a new economic action plan in October. We will again increase the number of modern apprenticeships in line with our commitment to 30,000 per year by 2020. And we will work in partnership with industry and trade unions to produce by early next year a new skills action plan, ensuring a skilled and productive workforce for the short, medium and long term. We will continue to support the South of Scotland Economic Partnership with £10 million of funding. And I can announce today that in the coming year we will introduce legislation to establish a South of Scotland Enterprise Agency. We will also continue to invest in the modern infrastructure a strong economy depends on. Around this time last year, the Queensferry Crossing opened and the M8 and Central Scotland motorway improvements were completed. This weekend, one of the largest new sections of the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route will open to traffic, and the road will be fully open by the end of this year. And in the coming year, we will continue to make progress towards the dualling of the A9. We will take forward important projects, including the Maybole bypass, and we will continue our ongoing road maintenance programme. Last year, I announced that Scotland would aim to remove the need for new diesel and petrol cars by 2032. We will now make further progress towards that goal. We will invest £15 million to add a further 1,500 electric charge points in homes, businesses and council premises across the country. We are increasing our low-carbon transport loan fund from £8 million to £20 million, enabling more businesses and individuals to make the switch to electric and other ultra-low emission vehicles. And over the next year, we will add 500 ultra-low emission vehicles to public sector fleets. In the coming year, the benefits of our massive investment in rail will come to fruition. By the end of next year, there will be a 20% increase in seating capacity and 200 new services will operate in eastern and central Scotland. And of course, we will take forward plans to enable a public sector bid for the next ScotRail franchise. On active travel, having doubled our investment in active travel last year, I can confirm that we will continue that level of investment in the year ahead. Digital infrastructure, of course, is now just as important as our transport links. We have exceeded our target of making fibre broadband available to 95% of properties across Scotland. And I can confirm today that the 3 main contracts from our Reaching 100% programme will be awarded in the coming year, ensuring that superfast broadband is available to every business and residential property in every part of Scotland. Presiding Officer, that is a £600 million pledge of truly universal coverage, unmatched elsewhere in the UK, and it will give Scotland a real competitive edge in the economy of tomorrow. The infrastructure investments I've talked about so far are important to the economy in the here and now. However, it is with an eye to the long term that I now turn to two potentially transformational commitments. Last year, I confirmed our intention to set up a Scottish National Investment Bank, and earlier this year, an implementation plan was published. I can confirm today that in the coming year, we will introduce the legislation that will formally underpin the Scottish National Investment Bank. The bank will provide patient finance for ambitious companies and important infrastructure projects, and it will do so in line with defined national missions, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It will be a cornerstone of the high innovation, low carbon economy we want to create here in Scotland, and the Finance Secretary will set out more detail tomorrow. But today I also want to set a wider investment ambition for Scotland. Traditionally, the level of government infrastructure investment in the UK has lagged behind other G7 countries. For Scotland to close that gap, we would need to increase annual investment by around 1% of GDP, equivalent to an additional £1.5 billion a year. I can announce today that we will aim to close that gap by the end of the next Parliament. The pledge I'm making today is to increase capital investment year on year, so that by 2025-26 it is £1.5 billion higher than the 2019-20 baseline of around £5 billion. And between now and then, that commitment will mean investment in our hospitals, schools, houses, transport, low-carbon technology and digital connections will be around £7 billion higher than our current spending projections. The Infrastructure Secretary will set out in the coming months the detail of how we will deliver on this pledge and the priorities for investment. But I can confirm today that, in addition to traditional capital and borrowing, the Scottish Futures Trust will examine new profit-sharing finance schemes, such as the Welsh Government's mutual investment model, to help secure both the investment we need and best value for the taxpayer. Presiding Officer, I hope the whole Parliament will get behind this national mission, a level of investment in our vital economic and social infrastructure that will protect and create jobs in the short term and support growth and productivity in the long term. Finally, on the economy, let me set out further action to protect and enhance Scotland's reputation as a trading nation. We have already taken steps to strengthen our presence in Europe and around the world, for example, by doubling SDI representation on mainland Europe and establishing new Scottish Government offices in Dublin and Berlin. Our new Paris and Ottawa offices will be open this autumn. In addition, I can announce today that we will launch a major new drive to increase exports. The value of our exports has grown strongly in the past year, but we need to do more. Right now, around 70 businesses account for approximately 50% of our international exports. It's vital that we grow that base. The new National Export Plan will be published in full by next spring, but after consultation with business, I can announce today some of the key strands that we will start on immediately. We will provide intensive support for 50 high-growth businesses each year to help them grow their overseas activity. We will create 100 new business-to-business peer mentorships each year to help new exporters. We will expand the network of specialists working in key overseas markets to identify untapped potential, and we will increase export finance support for companies looking to enter new markets. I can confirm that this work will be backed by £20 million of new funding over the next 3 years, helping to ensure that more of Scotland's world-class produce and innovations are enjoyed across the globe, with the benefits realised here at home. Presiding Officer, we must also continue to retain and attract talent. We want to make clear that Scotland remains an open, inclusive and outward-looking nation. So let me make this very clear again today. This government will always make the positive case for immigration. As part of that, we must protect EU citizens who already live here. We will argue that they should not have to pay settled status fees post-Brexit. It is simply wrong that people already making a contribution to our country should have to pay to retain rights they currently have to live and work here. However, if the UK Government persists, I can confirm that the Scottish Government will meet the settled status fees for EU citizens who work in our devolved public services. I can also announce that alongside an electoral reform bill, we will introduce an electoral franchise bill to ensure that current EU citizens who live in Scotland can continue to vote in Scottish Parliament and local government elections. These actions will provide practical help. They will also, I hope, send an important message that we highly value the contribution of EU citizens who have chosen to make Scotland their home, and we want them to stay. Supporting growth in our economy is essential, but so too is ensuring that growth is environmentally sustainable. Many of our actions will help us to meet the targets set out in the new Climate Change Bill, which will progress through Parliament in the coming year. Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions have almost halved since 1990. By 2050, they will have reduced by at least 90%. Achieving that target will mean that Scotland will be a carbon-neutral country by 2050. We will have no net emissions of carbon dioxide. I can also confirm our firm intention to move towards net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases, not simply carbon dioxide, as soon as we credibly can. It is, I think, worth being clear about the scale of our ambition. The targets in the Climate Change Bill for 2020, 2030 and 2040 are the most stringent statutory targets anywhere in the world without exception. And our 2050 target is the most ambitious anywhere in the world that is based solely on domestic actions rather than relying on paying other countries to reduce emissions for us. We recognise that the transition to a low-carbon economy is first and foremost an overwhelming moral imperative, but it is also a huge economic opportunity, and we are, by any reasonable benchmark, a global leader in living up to our international obligations. This programme for government will build on that record. As well as progressing the Climate Change Bill, we will continue to invest in projects such as the Central Scotland Green Network and the Water Environment Fund. I can confirm that in the coming year, we will ban the manufacture and sale of plastic-stemmed cotton buds. Following recent consultation, we will design and implement a deposit return scheme for drinks containers, and we will ask the expert panel on environmental charges to recommend other actions to reduce plastic pollution. We will also establish a national deep-sea marine reserve by the end of 2019. We also intend to establish an animal welfare commission to ensure that high standards of welfare are maintained for both domesticated and wild animals. And I can announce today that we will, by the end of this Parliament, introduce what is commonly known as Finn's Law to increase the available sentences for the worst forms of animal cruelty, including attacks on police dogs. In addition to creating a wealthier and greener Scotland, we will also create a fairer country. 2018 is Scotland's Year of Young People, a celebration of the contribution that children and young people make to our society. But the most important thing any government can do is make sure that all of our young people have a fair chance to succeed. We are striving to do that at all stages of young people's lives. The Baby Box has been a huge success, with more than 56,000 already delivered. Our plan to almost double childcare will help give every child the best possible start in life and save working families up to £4,500 a year for each child. Our work to deliver this commitment will continue in the year ahead, with almost 2,000 people starting on early learning and childcare apprenticeships, 1,500 additional college places and 400 extra graduate level places. And to ensure the quality of our early learning and childcare provision, a new standard for funded providers will be published before the end of this year. Closing the attainment gap and raising standards in our schools remains the overriding mission of this government. Progress is being made, but in the coming year our school reforms will accelerate. I can confirm today that by the end of this year, a new head teachers charter backed by new national guidance will be published. The charter will put head teachers much more in control of the important decisions on curriculum, staffing and budgets that are fundamental to the performance of their schools. We will also continue to invest an additional £180 million a year, including money direct to schools through the Pupil Equity Fund to help close the attainment gap. We will commit £10 million in this academic year to enhance the high-quality practical support and expertise that is available to teachers through the Regional Improvement Collaboratives and Education Scotland. And in the year ahead, we will pilot and roll out a new national survey of parents and carers as part of our recently published Parental Engagement Plan. We will also continue to protect free tuition for higher education. However, as part of our work to widen access to university, we will also take the first steps to implement the recommendations of the Independent Review of Student Support. I can confirm that next year we will invest £16 million to increase college bursaries and university grants for students from the lowest income families. We will also invest more than £5 million to increase bursaries and grants for care experienced young people at college or university to a level equivalent to the real living wage. Presiding Officer, extensive research shows that adverse experiences in childhood ACEs directly affect outcomes later in life. So we will continue to embed across all areas of our work a greater focus on preventing ACEs and also on supporting the resilience of children and adults to overcome childhood adversity. And finally, I said last year that we would consider how to further embed the principles of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law and policy, including the option of incorporation. Having now carefully considered this matter, I can announce today that we will incorporate the principles of the UN Convention into Scots law. We will work with partners and with Parliament to do it in the most effective way possible, but in this year of young people, there can be few more powerful symbols of this government's commitment to our young people. Children will also benefit from our actions to address poverty. The new Child Poverty Act sets targets for 2030 that will reduce child poverty to the lowest level in Scotland's history. We are now investing in the actions needed to achieve those targets. I can announce today that by June next year we will report on progress to develop a new income supplement. In the coming year we will also invest £12 million in an intensive parental employment support programme to help parents on low incomes gain employment and get on in their careers. We will also step up our work to eradicate holiday hunger, investing a further £2 million to tackle food insecurity amongst children. The coming year will see our work to create a Scottish social security system based on dignity and respect step up a gear. Our new agency, Social Security Scotland, is already open for business and moving firmly into its delivery phase. It is with great pride, therefore, that I can make these announcements today. Firstly, I can confirm that the first payments of the new Carers Allowance Supplement will begin next week. The supplement will benefit more than 75,000 carers, increasing their allowance by more than £400 a year. I can also announce that the new Young Carer Grant, worth £300 a year, will be paid from autumn next year. And in the coming year, we will provide enhanced assistance for those on lower incomes struggling with funeral costs. And finally, the year ahead will see us deliver the new Best Start Grant. This will provide the most extensive support anywhere in the UK for new parents on low incomes. £600 on the birth of a first child, £300 on the birth of any subsequent child, with no two-child limit or abhorrent rape clause, and £250 for each child when they start nursery and again when they start school. The Best Start Grant will benefit around 50,000 families each year. Presiding Officer, I said last year that the Best Start Grant would be paid from summer next year. I'm delighted to announce today that, assuming we get the required DWP cooperation, the first pregnancy and baby payments will be made before Christmas this year, 6 months ahead of schedule. Our work to build a fairer Scotland will also include in the year ahead a new consumer protection bill to secure fairer outcomes for consumers. And as part of our efforts to tackle fuel poverty, I can confirm that we will liaise with key stakeholders this year before formally consulting next year on our preferred model for a publicly owned, not-for-profit energy company. We will also continue to take concerted action to address homelessness and eradicate rough sleeping. Last year, we established the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group. It has already made its recommendations, with some of them already implemented. We have committed £21 million of additional funding, and I can confirm that before the end of this year, we will publish a comprehensive action plan setting out how we will deliver all 70 of the Action Group's recommendations. However, I can announce today that implementation of the Housing First approach will be central to our plans. This ensures that a homeless individual or household is moved directly into their own settled accommodation rather than through a variety of different housing options. In the first instance, from this autumn, we will work with Social Bite, the Glasgow Homelessness Network and the Cora Foundation to support Housing First Pathfinder projects in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Stirling and Dundee. We will also continue to invest in the supply of affordable housing. In this financial year, we will increase our support for affordable homes by more than a quarter, from £590 million to more than £750 million. And over this Parliament, we will ensure that more than 50,000 affordable homes are delivered, including at least 35,000 for social rent. Within this, we will work with councils and house builders to increase the supply of accessible housing for disabled people. We will also work with local governments, communities and businesses on short-term lets. We want to ensure that councils have the appropriate powers to balance the needs of their communities with wider economic interests. Of course, for investment in housing and infrastructure more generally to benefit communities fully, we need a fair and effective planning system. In the coming months, we will progress the new planning bill through Parliament and ensure that people get a chance to have an early say in shaping developments in their area. The voice of local communities is, of course, vital to our partnership with local government. This programme reaffirms our commitment to a strong partnership between national and local government. This is reflected in our work with COSLA to take forward the local governance review to strengthen local decision-making. I can also confirm today that we will extend the Community Land Fund to 2021 to enable more community land purchases, support the work of the Scottish Land Commission as it shapes land reform for the future, and steer the Scottish Crown Estate Bill through Parliament. I want to mention 3 further initiatives that will contribute to the strength and well-being of local communities. In 2 weeks' time, the new V&A Museum in Dundee will open to the public, a stunning reminder of the potential of culture to both regenerate and bring joy to communities across the country. So before the end of the year, we will publish a new national culture strategy, which will demonstrate the intrinsic value we attach to arts and culture and our determination to ensure that everyone can participate in cultural activities. Before the end of 2018, we will also publish a national strategy to tackle social isolation and loneliness. It will draw on the results of our recent consultation and make Scotland one of the first countries in the world to develop a strategy to address an issue which is of growing importance right around the world. And by March 2019, we will publish an older people's framework, setting out how we will achieve better outcomes in terms of services for older people, as well as in their participation in the labour market and engagement in their local communities. Presiding Officer, the 2 final areas I want to talk about today are justice and health. Recorded crime in Scotland is now at its lowest level since 1974. The reconviction rate is at its lowest level in almost 20 years, and 95% of people in Scotland rate their own neighbourhood as being fairly or very good. By any reasonable measure, this is a significant record of achievement, but we are determined to improve on it. We will protect the police revenue budget in real terms throughout this Parliament. In addition, £31 million will be provided for police reform in this financial year, helping the police to invest in new technology and work more effectively with partners. The fire service budget is also being protected, with an additional £15 million of spending capacity this year to help with, amongst other things, the introduction of rapid response vehicles and more full-time posts in our rural communities. Presiding Officer, as we reform the justice system, it remains absolutely vital that we improve the support we give to the victims of crime. We are, of course, already taking important steps to do that through, for example, the Vulnerable Witnesses Bill that we introduced to this Parliament last year. This year, we are determined that we will go even further. I am announcing today a major package of reforms that will better protect victims in the criminal justice system. Firstly, we will work with Victim Support Scotland to reduce and, where possible, eliminate the need for victims to retell their story to different organisations when they need help. We will also expand the range of serious offences where the victim has the right to make an impact statement, setting out to the court how they have been affected physically, emotionally or financially. We will consult on the details of this early next year. We will improve the information and support available to victims and families when prisoners are released from prison and consult on proposals to increase the transparency of the parole system. And finally, we will establish a new support service to provide more and better help to families who have been bereaved by murder or culpable homicide. Presiding Officer, we will also continue to improve the support available to victims of rape and sexual assault. We recently, over the summer, announced additional funding of £1.1 million to enable sexual offence trials to come to court as quickly as possible. Today, I am announcing that we will make available a further £2 million over 3 years to speed up access to support for those affected by rape or sexual assault. £1.5 million of this additional funding will go to rape crisis centres starting next month, with the remainder available to meet particular local needs. In the coming year, we will also consult on proposals to ensure that in cases of rape or sexual assault, forensic medical examinations and access to healthcare more generally are a priority for the NHS and provided consistently across Scotland. We intend to bring forward legislation later in this Parliament. We will also work to continue to reduce and eliminate domestic abuse. The legislation already passed by Parliament to make coercive or controlling behaviours illegal will, of course, come into force this year. I can confirm today that we will now consult on the introduction of new protective orders which can bar perpetrators of domestic abuse from their victims' homes. In addition, we will introduce a new family law bill to provide further protection for domestic abuse victims in contact or residence cases and ensure that children's best interests are central to the consideration of all such cases. And finally, we will introduce a female genital mutilation bill to strengthen the protection provided to women and girls. There are a range of other important measures that we will take to improve the justice system. We will consult later this year on changes to modernise and improve the law on hate crime. We will extend the presumption against ineffective short sentences from 3 to 12 months once additional safeguards are in place for domestic abuse victims. In addition, legislation for new drug driving limits covering 17 different drug types will be introduced and will come into force in 2019. This, together with Scotland's already lower drink drive limit, will ensure that we continue to lead the way in the UK when it comes to improving road safety. A biometric data bill will provide for a code of practice for acquiring, using, retaining and disposing of data such as fingerprints and DNA samples. It will take forward the recommendations of the Independent Advisory Group and modernise the law in an area of huge importance to the entire justice system. And we will introduce a new disclosure bill to strike a better balance between helping people with convictions to gain employment and providing strong safeguards for vulnerable people and the general public. I can also announce today that in the year ahead we will consult on reforms to the law of defamation with a view to bringing forward legislation later in this Parliament. Presiding Officer, we are, as a Parliament, indeed as a country, proud of our reputation as one of the very best places anywhere in the world for LGBTI+ people, and we want to make further progress in the months and years ahead. I can therefore confirm that we will continue work to develop legislation to reform the law on gender recognition. And in the coming year, we will introduce a census bill which will permit the National Records of Scotland in future censuses to ask questions on sexual orientation and transgender status. Presiding Officer, the final important area I want to talk about today is health. Last week's inpatient survey results showed that satisfaction with our National Health Service remains at a very high level. Our accident and emergency facilities have been the best performing in the whole of the UK for the last 3 years. Outcomes like this are, I believe, a tribute to the expertise, the dedication and the compassion of NHS staff across the country. It is therefore absolutely right that NHS staff will receive a minimum pay rise of 9% over the next 3 years. Last year, we introduced to this Parliament 2 important health bills which are due to come into force next year. The Human Tissue Authorisation Bill will implement an opt-out system for organ donation, and the Health and Care Staffing Bill will ensure we have the right staff in the right places. However, all of us know that our National Health Service, in common with health services across the UK and elsewhere, faces significant challenges. The key challenge is adapting to an ageing population, which is, of course, a good thing, and the rising demand that flows from that. So we will continue to meet our pledge to invest record sums in the National Health Service. However, we will also progress important reforms to how care is delivered and take further action to improve population health. Over the next year, we will take forward work to implement the new GP contract. We will support integration of health and social care, and we will invest a higher proportion of the health budget in primary, community and social care. From next year, we will also implement Frank's Law, extending free personal care to eligible under 65-year-olds. And we will continue to champion a preventative approach to Scotland's public health challenges. In May, we became the first country anywhere in the world to introduce minimum alcohol pricing. This year, we will take forward plans to reduce childhood obesity. Amongst other measures, we will consult on restricting the promotion and marketing of food and drink that is high in fat, sugar or salt. Preventing ill health and building up community services are absolutely essential to ensuring a health service fit for the future. But so too is ensuring that acute services can meet the demands placed on them. We know that rising demand has put significant pressure on waiting times, and we recognise that current performance is not good enough. I can therefore announce today that the Health Secretary will later this month publish a waiting times improvement plan, setting out a range of short and medium-term actions to substantially and sustainably improve waiting times performance. Part of the longer-term plan to meet waiting time targets on a sustainable basis is the creation over this Parliament of 5 new elective treatment centres. I can therefore confirm today that work on the new West of Scotland Centre at the Golden Jubilee Hospital will start in the early part of next year, and work on the North of Scotland Centre at Raigmore in Inverness will be underway by the middle of next year. I can also confirm today that as part of our work to create a specialist major trauma network, new major trauma centres will open in Aberdeen next month and in Dundee in November. Finally, Presiding Officer, I want to turn to mental health. As the stigma around mental health reduces, demand for services is rising. We have a duty to meet that demand quickly and to meet it appropriately. That means doing more to support positive mental health and prevent ill health. It means delivering greater provision of mental health support in communities, including in our schools. And it means ensuring that those experiencing serious illness can access specialist services more quickly. Today I'm announcing a package of measures that will complement our mental health strategy. It will be backed by £250 million of additional investment starting this year and progressively increasing over the subsequent 4 years. The Mental Health Minister will set out full details shortly, but let me cover some of the key elements now. Firstly, we will develop a stronger network of care and support for the 1 in 5 new mothers, around 11,000 a year, who experience mental health problems during and after pregnancy. This will include greater access to counselling for those experiencing mild symptoms and an expansion of specialist services for those with moderate or severe illness. Secondly, we will utilise technology to extend access for adults to a range of support services. This will include improvements to the NHS 24 breathing space service, extending online access to cognitive behavioural therapy, improving access to psychological assessment and therapy in our rural areas, and strengthening the handling of mental health calls to the 111 service. However, most of our additional investment will support improvements to the provision of child and adolescent mental health services. The Task Force on Children and Young People's Mental Health will report this autumn. However, based on the early discussions held by its chair, Dr Dame Denise Coyer, there are a range of actions we are committed to taking now. Firstly, we will invest £60 million in additional school nursing and counselling services. This will support 350 counsellors and 250 additional school nurses and ensure that every secondary school has a counselling service. We will enhance support and professional learning materials for teachers and ensure that by the end of academic year 2019-20, every local authority has access to mental health first aid training for teachers. We will fund an additional 80 counsellors to work across further and higher education, and we will develop a community mental wellbeing service for 5 to 24-year-olds, offering immediate access to counselling, self-care advice and family and peer support. We will also put in place plans to fast-track young people with the most serious mental illness to specialist services, as well as taking targeted action in the short term to reduce the longest waits for services. Presiding Officer, as I said a moment ago, more detail will be published shortly, but I hope the package I have announced today underlines the commitment of this government to ensuring that our health services value and support mental well-being just as much as physical well-being. Presiding Officer, the budget bill will complete and indeed underpin our legislative programme for the coming year. The 12 bills we will introduce in the coming session are, of course, part of a much wider programme of work to tackle the major social and economic challenges of the day. Over the next 12 months, this government will also make progress towards doubling free childcare provision, further narrow the attainment gap in our schools and widen access to our universities, pay the first benefits in Scotland's new social security system and take further action to tackle poverty and inequality. We will help our NHS adapt to an ageing population and begin a transformation of mental health services. We will tackle major public health challenges and legislate for a Scottish National Investment Bank, invest for the future and support more businesses to sell their goods across the globe. We will support the transition to a low-carbon economy, and we will do everything we possibly can to protect our economy from Brexit and to put Scotland on the right track for the future. I commend this programme for government to Parliament.
Thank you very much. We turn now to the open debate, and I would invite all members who wish to speak in the debate, certainly who wish to speak this afternoon, to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, this is the 12th SNP programme for government, and it's the 3rd under this First Minister. It comes a year after last year's programme for government, when, following the general election, the First Minister declared a radical relaunch of her administration. Before turning to today's offering, let us briefly summarise how that relaunch has gone. Last year, 15 new bills were promised, yet of those bills, just 2 have passed. One was the critically important Historic Pardons Bill, which was overdue and enjoyed unanimous support across this chamber. The other was the somewhat more technical bill making changes to property tax, which had no amendments at stage 2, no amendments at stage 3, and was so uncontroversial that even Murdo Fraser was forced to declare, "I have very little to say." Of the remainder of the bills promised in last year's programme for government, only 3 have progressed past stage 1. 7 bills in Parliament's in-tray haven't even had a deadline set for the completion of stage 1, and 7 bills from last year's programme weren't even published until the end of the summer term. It was the proverbial essay crisis. In fact, this programme for government has a total of 13 bills that are a hangover from last year. That is the highest that it has ever been under the SNP, even at the end of the last Parliament or when major events such as the referendum crowded the public debate. Presiding Officer, those are the facts on last year's programme. They had great ambitions, but remarkably little legislation has happened. Not so much a relaunch as a retread. So what did we have in the past year instead of that fresh new agenda? Well, we had a fracking ban that wasn't a fracking ban. We had a new Teach First system that excluded Teach First. A new state-owned energy company that so far hasn't produced any energy. We had a railway police merger backed by almost no one and which has now finally been shelved. A new named person scheme that doesn't work. A new economic plan that is so streamlined it has 23 separate strategies. Of course, there was one thing the government did manage to publish in the last year, and that was yet another new blueprint for independence, courtesy of a Growth Commission report. But all of these failures, all of them, were dwarfed by the real letdown from last year's programme for government, and that was the climb down on the education bill. This time last year, Nicola Sturgeon told us that the education bill would, and I quote, give head teachers significantly new powers, influence, responsibilities. It would formally establish them as leaders of learning and teaching. Our premise is a simple but powerful one, she said. The best people to make decisions about a child's education are the people who know them best, their teachers and parents. And just in case we're left in any doubt as to the significance of this bill, she said a new education bill will deliver the biggest and most radical change to how our schools are run that we have seen in the lifetime of devolution. She called it the centrepiece of her plan. And then what happened? A consultation was launched, and then in June, John Swinney shelved it. And then he said he might think again. It is an unholy mess, and it is entirely of the SNP's making. And at stake is the education of a generation of our children. When Nicola Sturgeon claimed that education was our top priority, we were pretty sceptical. But we said that we would work with the SNP if it meant the right thing for our schools. We're not even asking the SNP to bring forward proposals that they don't agree with. We're just asking them to bring forward the ones that they themselves argued for last year, that they said they needed radical legislation in order to underpin. So bring back to the Parliament the proposals that you drew up on raising attainment, on giving head teachers more powers, on measure they outlined to give parents more say in school improvement and school policies. Because we have argued for such empowerment of teachers and parents for years. And we have the votes to get them through this Parliament, votes that we will gladly cast to get a better deal for our pupils. I know your time was protected, but I will gladly take a question from the First Minister.
I've just set out the fact that by the end of this year, a new head teachers charter will deliver all of these powers to head teachers. So can I be clear, is Ruth Davidson asking that instead of doing that by the end of this year, we bring forward legislation to delay it by 18 months to 2 years? Is that really her position? Isn't what's most important is that head teachers have the powers they need?
Ruth Davidson.
I love the idea that the First Minister thinks the people of Scotland are mugs enough to believe when she stood here 12 months ago and said we need a radical bill for the most radical change to our schools to make it better, because under my watch they have gone down in terms of standards. And now she stands here and says that bill will get in the way. The people of Scotland are not mugs. You binned the bill because you couldn't get it through. You listened to vested interests. We're offering you the votes. Bring back the bill and we will get the parts of it that we have supported for years past. But do not stand there, First Minister. Do not stand there and say that you care about the children of Scotland so much you need a radical bill, ditch the bill, and then say the bill didn't matter in the first place. Don't you dare say that. We want to know why the government thinks that their rights over the next 1,000 days, 1,000 days less to the end of this election, will come back to more backtracking and inaction. And because we've heard how much was promised last year but not delivered, forgive us for treating this year's programme for government with a greater load of salt. Because this government has shown that they are very, very good on promises and consultations, but a little bit less energetic when it comes to delivery and action. So as I turn to this year's bill, let me first say of all which do have our support, so that we can get on with the job of scrutinising, improving and actually passing some legislation in this chamber. We welcome the government's adoption of Finns Law to increase the available sentences to the worst forms of animal cruelty, including attacks on police dogs. And I pay tribute to my colleague Liam Kerr, who has worked tirelessly on this issue, who has mobilised the support of thousands of Scots and has welcomed Finn to Parliament before the summer recess. On the wider mental health programme, I know that the sector has voiced some concern over recent years with a mental health strategy that lacked ambition and then a suicide prevention plan which was disappointingly late. So this is overdue, and the government has some catching up to do. But they will have our full support in ensuring treatment and support is there for those who need it. We have all acted for constituents waiting too long for vital services. We have all seen a growing understanding in our communities and across society of the importance of mental health, and we have now a chance to give mental health the attention it so deserves. I believe all parties will support this plan, and similarly, I expect broad support and pledge my parties for measures to combat female genital mutilation and domestic abuse. On welfare, we will engage positively and responsibly, as we did during the passage of the Child Poverty Bill last term. And on the economy, it was the Scottish Conservatives who first introduced the policy of a separate enterprise agency for the South of Scotland in our 2016 manifesto. We were pleased when the Scottish Government picked up the ball and ran with it, and we support the legislation announced today that underpins it. So too the focus on increasing exports, including the establishment of 2 new Scottish Government hubs inside the British embassies in Dublin and Berlin. On electric vehicles, the new fund is welcome and it is necessary. Roughly 1% of our vehicles are currently electric, and at the current rate, Scotland wouldn't be all electric for another 600 years. We know that the Scottish Government will be receiving £2 billion extra in funding through Barnett Consequentials over the next 4 years, and we await to see a much fuller explanation of how that money is to be spent. And in terms of further information, there are measures here we either cannot support or where we need a much greater level of detail, and so do the Scottish public. Today's programme states that the Electoral Reform Bill will have a consultation on prisoner voting. We believe that those who commit crimes and are sentenced to incarceration do not just surrender their right to liberty, but their voting rights too, and we will stand against any attempts to change that. On EU national voting rights, we do support the First Minister's commitments today, which mirrors the commitments set out by the UK Government in December of last year. And on the Investment Bank, we welcome any measure to help small business and will scrutinise the legislation in good faith. But from what we've seen so far, there is nothing new or bold about rehashed plans for an investment bank that broadly already exists in the form of the Scottish Investment Bank, and that the SNP have essentially promised to do before. Last year's programme promised a £36 million growth fund. By the start of last summer, just £2 million had been distributed. The year before, the SNP promised a £500 million fund of loans and investment for businesses. But then it turned out that they were mostly rebadging existing funds. And last week, we found out that not a single penny had been given in loans. So there is a pattern with SNP economic policy. Big promises turned into small change. And let's hope it's not the same with this bank. And as to today's red meat to the SNP activists, we on this side of the chamber do not believe that you answer the questions raised by leaving one union by threatening to leave another, worth more than 4 times more than Scotland in terms of trade, and neither do the people of Scotland. But what's striking about this overall package, though, is that the SNP legislation seems to be finely tuned in terms of headlines, but less honed when it comes to substance. A textbook example of knee-jerk backside covering just-in-timeism. Because if we take the announcement on mental health the First Minister has spent today loudly proclaiming, why has it taken until the day we see the worst ever waits on record for children to receive treatment before the government acts? Or this morning's radio roundup from the First Minister, promising the country she'll invest more in hospitals. But why have we gotten to crisis point before action is contemplated? Why do we see today record numbers of NHS vacancies? Over 3,300 nursing and midwife posts lying empty, almost 6 times the rate of 7 years ago. And who was the Health Minister 7 years ago who presided over a 20% cut in nurses' training places? Why, it was the First Minister, the same First Minister who stands here looking for applause for last-ditch attempts to fix problems of her own making. So what we have here is a batch of measures long on spin and short on substance. So let me speak directly to the opposition parties. It is clear with a minority government that Parliament can act with greater power. There are issues on which even parties which come from the opposite end of the political spectrum can find common cause. And because much of this legislation is so vague in intent, we have a chance to make real changes. The planning bill, for example, I'm not sure that anyone knows exactly what the government is really trying to achieve here. That's why it's so wide open to amend. And it's why opposition parties have been able to make a real impact on the shape of the bill, and where legislation has failed to keep up with technology, such as in short-term lets, we are ready to work with all to get a fair deal for Scottish householders. Or take the Safe Staffing Bill. Safe staffing is, of course, necessary, but it is also a legal nonsense if it is not backed up by policy. And I think the draft published shows how flimsy the thinking is. Opposition parties have the chance not just to improve, but to radically alter that legislation. On these issues and others, let's work together to do just that. And I can make clear that I will work with Greens and Liberal Democrats and Labour politicians who agree on an issue-by-issue basis to move things forward. Because increasingly, we are running out of patience. Since the last election, it has taken the SNP up to 700 days to get a bill passed. We've now got less than 1,000 to the next election, meaning that given the tortuously slow pace, there isn't much time left. The record of past years is not much to look at, and the chances for this year seem little better. And if the SNP isn't going to get a move on, then it is up to us to up the pace. And while I might not be here in person for a wee while to push our agenda forward, the Scottish Conservative Group will redouble efforts to campaign for change, for greater rights for the families of victims caught up in the justice system so they are no longer treated as an afterthought. We have warm hearts here, but we want a commitment to introducing Michelle's Law in full, to use the extra investment that we know is coming to the NHS to support and maintain local services across Scotland, to make the case for real radical action on housing, to support more action on vocational and technical education for those young people who choose not to go to university, and above all, demanding the reality of the Scottish Government's new thinking on economic growth matches today's rhetoric. We know what the Scottish Government's own forecasts say, that Scotland faces 5 years of subdued growth, the longest period since the Second World War. And we believe that Scotland should be the most attractive place in the UK to live, work and do business. We have the resources, the people, the industry, everything but the weather. But this government has tarnished that ambition with its anti-business agenda. A Scottish growth rate that is lower than the UK every calendar year since 2010 is not something for this government to trumpet, it's something for it to remedy. So come the budget time, we will campaign against the high tax agenda of this SNP administration. We will call for its confused and cluttered economic strategy to be redrawn, and we will argue for a renewed focus on our world-class capability in oil and gas, in food and drink, sustainable energy, life sciences and financial services. There is a good news story to tell about the Scottish economy, and we intend to make it. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, the start of a new term is not the time to be overly cynical, but given the sclerosis of this government's record, it is wise to be sceptical when we see the SNP bearing legislative gifts today. Gifts promised, which all too often in the past get lost in the post. This year, the Scottish Conservatives will continue with the job that we were elected to carry out, to hold the SNP government to account, to oppose vigorously where they go wrong, and to offer constructive opposition where we believe progress can be made. We wish old and new government ministers well as they approach their task this year, but they should know that time is not their friend. The Parliament is at its midpoint. There is much still to do, and too much time has already been squandered. The country cannot afford for this SNP government to be distracted, either by noises off, nor an unwanted rush to yet more constitutional division. Presiding Officer, it is a time for action and deeds. It is a time to stop chasing headlines and to get on with delivery.
Thank you. Thank you, and I call on Richard Leonard to open for the Labour Party.
Can I thank the First Minister for an advance copy of her statement? Presiding Officer, it's the job of my party to ask difficult questions of the First Minister and to hold the government to account. And this Parliament and the people who sent us here can rest assured that we will do that week in and week out. But let me, at the very start of this new parliamentary term, strike a genuine note of unity. Because I want to begin by expressing the full support of the Scottish Labour Party to the First Minister, full support in the fulfilment of her government's duty to thoroughly investigate and act upon all allegations of sexual harassment which arise. And let me equally say, genuinely to the First Minister, that she also has our total backing in ensuring that the Scottish Government fulfils its duty of care to the women involved in all such cases and in providing them with all of the support they need when they need it. You have our full backing, and on that, I hope I speak for every member here. Can I also record that we do indeed welcome today's announcement on mental health? It is something which the Labour Party has long campaigned for, and the publication just this morning of the latest figures on child and adolescent mental health serve as a timely reminder of how potentially important this announcement this afternoon is. This year alone, over 2,500 young people have waited more than 18 weeks for treatment. The review of CAMHS, published in June after years of pressure, exposed a system simply not fit for purpose, with young people being rejected from treatment because they weren't deemed suicidal. The system needs to change, and I hope that today is the first step towards doing that. And I'm bound to say that I also welcome a toughening of the rules around regional selective assistance awards. But we look to the day when the living wage is a requirement for all companies bidding for all public procurement contracts too, not just those receiving grants. Presiding officer, the First Minister has raised it, so let me say clearly, these benches oppose a second independence referendum, and we urge the First Minister to drop any plans for it once and for all. Brexit throws into sharp relief the challenges of leaving one political and economic union. And let us be clear on this as well. Leaving the United Kingdom would mean an unprecedented decade of austerity for the people of Scotland. Not my analysis, presiding officer, but the analysis of the SNP's own Cuts Commission published in May, including the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Economy. And in the end, the real division we face is not between the people of the four nations of the United Kingdom. It is between the rich few and the rest of us. That's the divide the First Minister should be focused on, not dividing the people of Scotland with another referendum. There are some elements from today's programme which are missing. In education, there is no mention of scrapping Primary 1 standardised assessments. There is no mention either of the need to deliver a fair pay deal for Scotland's teachers, or to raise the upper limit on the number of home-based students entering higher education. In health, there is no mention of the compelling case for imposing a cap on spiralling agency costs in the National Health Service. The First Minister talks of wealth and well-being, but is silent on the distribution of wealth and well-being. The government knows that the inequality gap is getting wider. It knows because its own report published last year showed that the richest 1% in Scotland now own more personal wealth than the whole of the poorest 50% put together. And the government must know this does not just result in a huge imbalance of wealth, it results in a huge imbalance of power. And whilst the First Minister and the Scottish Government may choose a vocabulary of radicalism and ambition, in reality they have emptied both of their real meaning. And worse, it is a vocabulary which has been appropriated not for the sake of meaningfully changing the lives of the people of Scotland, but for the sake of the political management and the positioning of the Scottish National Party. 11 years into the SNP office, where is the vitality? Where is the driving force? Where is the real radical vision in this programme for government? Over those 11 years in office, the SNP's ambition has simply not kept up with the growth in this Parliament's powers. For our part, Labour will welcome the use of those powers and will always push for a more radical agenda. So whilst we welcome the commitment to the Best Start grant before Christmas, We will continue to campaign for an upgrading of child benefit for all of the years whilst our children are growing up. Presiding Officer, over the summer recess, I have been visiting communities and speaking to people across Scotland. I listened to the asylum seekers in Glasgow facing eviction and deportation and met with a resilient community which is standing by them. I talked to tenants and residents in Alloa, struggling with rising rents, witnessing a housing crisis, demanding new investment to bring about real change. I knocked on the doors of elderly people in Ayrshire who told me of their GP services, cut back since spring of this year. These were elderly people in the village of Tarbolton, in the constituency of the new Cabinet Secretary for Health. I met with business owners and trade unions, all seeking certainty and firm economic planning, and looking for a Scottish Government which does not just promise a national investment bank in the future, but one which delivers a national industrial strategy now. Just last week, I listened to the fishing industry in Shetland, who are concerned this government does not have a plan if we crash out of the European Union next spring. I talked to the Food 365 workers in Coatbridge, where practical welfare action by the local Labour Council is making a real difference to the lives of bright kids who just want a chance in life. I listened to the communities. I listened to the communities who have taken over the land where they live and work, from the Mull of Galloway to West Harris. And I have met with workers up and down the country who have had enough of their living standards falling year after year. Young workers exploited in the hospitality industry, and workers of all ages getting organised, getting unionised because they know the time has come to fight back. We are seeing a reinvention of citizenship, a new political engagement, a democratic renewal, but it is not based on national identity, but on the universal values of solidarity, of equality, and a hunger for real and radical change. Presiding Officer, in this next parliamentary year, we will mark and celebrate the 20th anniversary of the first elections to this Parliament. It was an event which awakened hope. We now want to reawaken that hope once again by showing that we can take a different path, one which really is radical and ambitious, one which really will bring about real change, a pathway which the people of Scotland deserve.
Thank you very much, and I call Patrick Harvey to open for the Green Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Government for the advance copy of the statement. This year's programme for Government takes place in perhaps the most difficult context of any since devolution. The Brexit crisis continues to play out, still with no hint of realism coming from the negotiations, and the UK Government continuing to treat this Parliament with contempt. Now, this mess, of course, is not of Scotland's making, but in the face of it, both the Scottish Government and Parliament have a responsibility not only to defend Scotland's interests against the multiple threats of Brexit, but also to ensure that the crisis does not prevent an ambitious programme of policy and legislation to address the needs of the people we represent. To give some credit where it's due, I want to pick out a few positives from the statement. Electoral reform might not be the biggest headline grabber, but I want to flag that up because the commitment to see EU citizens' right to vote protected, and what's not explicit in the programme but has been made clear in previous statements in Parliament, and I hope it remains the position, the commitment that residence will be the test of voting right, not citizenship. So non-EU citizens, including refugees and asylum seekers, should have the right to vote. And I pick this out, as I say, not because it's the biggest headline grabber, but because it is strongly consistent with a government that says it wants to make a positive case for immigration and free movement. That is a principle that the Greens very strongly share, and I was pleased to hear it. I was also pleased to see progress on the Young Carers Grant, something the Greens pushed for in the 2016 election and since. And positive comments as well on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but we will look closely at the detail of what's proposed on that. Will the Convention itself be incorporated and become part of domestic law? The government is also clearly more open than it has been in the past to commitments to the work that needs done to make sure that we have a public rail operator and a public energy company. But we will want to see more detail and a clear commitment to the timing on both of those measures. Over recent years, Presiding Officer, the Greens have worked hard to do what we said we would in the last election, pushing the government beyond its comfort zone, leading the change that Scotland needs. And from community rail funding to protecting local services, from safeguarding the marine environment to winning the case for a new, fairer system of income tax, our approach has got results. But it's clear that there remain parts of the programme for government where we'll need to step up that pressure for change. The First Minister is committing to increasing capital investment year on year. I remind her that in the budget concession from last year, they've already committed to increasing the proportion of Scotland's capital spending that goes to low-carbon projects. So I hope that that remains a consistent principle that won't be deflected by the wider increase in their capital budget. The Scottish Household Survey just out today shows that 61% of adults in 2017 said that climate change is an immediate and urgent problem. That's up since the previous year significantly. And it's clear that the government wants to be seen to move in this direction. It's still the case, though, in Scottish politics that we're not dealing with a denial of the problem, but we do need to recognise that the scale of what's being proposed bears no relationship to the scale of the challenge. There is a missed opportunity to commit to a net zero greenhouse gas target, but rather than just the debate over that technical question of precisely which target to set, it's equally important to focus on the questions of how. What will we be doing to transform, for example, our transport system? And again, today we have statistics just published by the government. Bus use down by 9.5%, cycling down by 7%, car use is up, and 2/3 of those journeys are single occupancy. Installing more electric charging points will do nothing to change that. And the increase in aviation, of course, remains entirely fossil fuel powered. The everlasting growth that that industry seeks would leave our other efforts on climate change looking futile. And it's not just transport. The wider transition to a post-oil age requires an acceptance that most of the world's fossil fuels must remain unburned, and Scotland must play its part in that too. There's an overwhelming case for divestment from fossil fuels and instead building an economy which can provide lasting jobs for the future in industries that don't depend on exploiting finite resources. I'm sad to say it remains entirely unclear that the Scottish Government understands the scale of that task. There are some positive measures like the deposit return scheme, banning cotton buds that are made of plastic. Fine, all well and good on their own terms. But measures like this are firmly based on placing the responsibility on individuals, not on transforming the wider economic context within which we all live. The government's focus on support for business, for example, as the First Minister made clear some commitments on that today. They remain wedded to the idea of increasing GDP and increasing exports, but no word in that section of her speech on ethics, on ensuring that that public taxpayer-funded support to the private sector is tied to commitments on the living wage, or commitments on ending tax avoidance, on divestment from the arms trade and the fossil fuel industries which the Scottish Government, just as the UK Government, continues to support. When the SNP took office in their first term of government, there were parts of the National Performance Framework which clearly suggested the beginnings of an understanding that GDP growth alone is the wrong basis for judging the health of our economy. That agenda appears to have stalled. We'll continue to make the case for a change. The First Minister also asks us to welcome the idea of a head teacher's charter, because she wants to do some of what was going to be in her bill without actually bringing it to Parliament to seek support.
The head teacher's charter, she says, will put them in control of decisions. But will they also have the funds necessary to reverse previous years of decline in teachers and other staff? Or will head teachers be left, in fact, in the lurch, made personally responsible for evermore, but without the resources and the backup staff they need to ensure that their schools can achieve what our society needs of them? The government must accept that in our education system, resources, not structural reforms, that should be the priority. There's a number of other issues, Presiding Officer, where the Greens are keen to call on the government to work with us. My colleague John Finney's bill on equal protection, the government has already indicated an intention to support. I hope that will also be true of Mark Ruskell's work on 20-mile-an-hour speed limits and Alison Johnson's work on the need for a real ban on fox hunting. But it's on local government where I think we have our work cut out to push the government beyond its comfort zone. The First Minister and the programme for government speak of a strong commitment, a strong partnership between central and local government. If that is the case, there is no reason in the world that we should not be supporting COSLA's call for the power to decide for themselves on issues like a transient visitor levy, a tourism tax, to raise the revenue that local government needs. There's a huge agenda and a huge opportunity to ensure that we have strong local government, which is normal in so many other European countries, with the financial powers available to them to make sure that they can raise revenue fairly instead of hiking fees and charges or making cuts to valuable services. There's a bill, I don't have time, I'm afraid. There's a bill coming on non-domestic rates, another opportunity to decentralise financial powers. So we'll make clear, as we have done since the last budget process, that we'll only be able to begin to discuss the next budget if the government makes meaningful progress on the reform of local taxation and local fiscal powers, an area we'll continue to push further for because we know that right across Scotland, those powers and those resources are urgently needed.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. And I call on Willie Rennie to open for the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Of course, there are sections of this programme that we can all support, and we on these benches will work constructively to deliver them. I welcome in particular the commitment on the incorporation of the principles of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But when I received an advance copy of the programme, I thought this couldn't possibly be it all. I must have been missing Volume 2. It was so light in its content. A particular highlight for me in the contribution from the First Minister was when she said that she was going to liaise this year to consult next year to deliver who knows when. That typified this whole programme for government. It is so light on substance. I suppose every government runs its natural course. Based on this programme, this government's sell-by date is well past. After 11 years in power, this government is showing all the signs of being at the end, searching around for new ideas. The old ideas are being found out. The performance of public services is on the slide. The ministerial team has changed, but it is still the same old policies. In fact, the former Minister for Recycling has himself been recycled. But it's the whole government that needs to be upcycled, repurposed into something fit for the future. And because this government arrived at St Andrew's House with a single purpose of leaving the United Kingdom, there has been a special air of desperation since that referendum. Since then, they have struggled to discover any real purpose for their remaining time in office. And this programme for government tells us all we needed to know. The First Minister grasped at first onto education. It was her overriding priority, her first objective, but has only come up with a series of damaging managerial changes. And there is nothing positive or new in this programme for government either. Then there was mental health. The First Minister has told me for 3 years, I stood on election platforms with her for 3 successive elections, and she told me that she really cared about mental health, that this was a priority. Take today's figures, the worst waits for young people, Just 67.8% of children met the 18-week waiting time target. That's down from 71%, and from the previous year down from 81%. It's even worse in some parts of the country. Forth Valley, Grampian and the Borders, all of them failed to achieve just 50%, way below the national average. And then you come to Tayside. Tayside, it's disgraceful. 34% meeting the target. How disgraceful is that? No new announcement today, 3 years after the First Minister told me it was her priority, can cover up for the failure of this government on mental health. There is not even one single recognition in our statement today of these terrible waiting times for young people. Not even one mention, not even one note of contrition for the failure of this government. And then, of course, we've got Brexit. Brexit is mentioned, of course, but the only real commitment is to consider what to do when the proposals come out. How bold and ambitious is that? The First Minister can't even bring herself to back the one policy that could save us from its damaging effects, the people's vote. With unusual and curious modesty, she says it's not for the SNP government to lead the United Kingdom. What happened to the First Minister of 2015, who took the UK general election by storm, wowing the rest of the United Kingdom with her plans to change the whole of the United Kingdom? So the hunt for the new purpose goes on. Step forward, Keith Brown, the new deputy leader. He told that oracle of integrity, The National, a fresh case for independence is more vital than ever. And that is what we are working on the National Assemblies. The fresh, new idea turns out to be the same old idea. It's the same Keith Brown who sold the dodgy Chinese deal to the First Minister. He sold so many bad ideas to the First Minister. Maybe it's not a surprise he's been told to sell the new case for independence to members of the SNP. Is independence first, last and always with the SNP? Nothing else matters. So let me put forward in contrast some positive new plans. Instead of the damaging national testing in schools, let's empower teachers to shed the burden of tests and explore how best to utilise their skills and training. Most countries in the world would not dream of starting their young people in formal education at 4 or 5 years old. 6 or 7 is the norm. With global best practice, let us embrace that new approach. Instead of damaging long waits for people requiring mental health treatment, let's adopt a new Mental Health Improvement Act. It would give parity of esteem between physical and mental health. It would be backed up with a requirement for all public bodies to have a duty to provide mental well-being support across the range of their services. It would accelerate improvements to mental health services. Instead of hunting for ways to leave the United Kingdom, let's offer up a new United Kingdom Cooperation Act that would agree a new dispute resolution procedures with the nations and regions of the United Kingdom. Instead of demanding a veto, it would offer the hand of friendship and cooperation to resolve disputes over issues. Let's put down the offer of cooperation with the UK government so we can rebuild that relationship that our two governments have worked so hard to undermine in recent years. We have seen the Westminster Constitution Select Committee endorse the idea of a more modern framework. It sounds like federalism to me. It's the right to ask the Scottish Government to be part of the growing calls for a modernised United Kingdom. Instead of dithering over the people's vote, let's pledge our support for the United Kingdom legislation necessary to agree such a vote. The First Minister should get out of her bunker and lead the charge on the campaign. With the weight of the government behind her, it would give the campaign further momentum. Her current dithering is undermining the case for the people's vote. Nicola Sturgeon needs to sign up today. Liberal Democrats want a local government funding act that would look at a new land value tax and a tourism infrastructure charge. It would be the necessary reforms required to empower local councils to deliver the services that they are responsible for. Just like Holyrood, local councils should have the power to raise the majority of the money that they spend. That would empower them in a way that has been prevented in recent years. If you control the purse strings, you can control your destiny on the areas of responsibility. These are the fresh, new ideas that this government should have brought forward in this programme, but all is not lost. There is still time to change. The government should stand up on education, on local government finance, on Brexit, on reform in the United Kingdom and on mental health. Use the power, for goodness sake, use the power of this Parliament for the well-being of this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Rennie. We turn now to the open part of the debate, and I'm going to call Alistair Allen to be followed by Adam Tompkins. Alistair Allen.
Presiding Officer, if I may reflect briefly, this is the first time in over 7 years that I have had the chance to address the chamber from the back benches. Now, as anyone who has had the privilege of being a minister will realise, that job in many ways restricts the opportunities actually to speak in Parliament very often. So while there may be disappointment ahead for anyone hoping that any new sense of freedom on my part means I now intend to go quite so far as to embrace my inner Kenneth Gibson, I do look forward to a chance to raise a wider variety of issues. So today, the First Minister has laid out an ambitious vision for Scotland in this year's programme for government, and I want to say something on it from the perspective of Scotland's island communities, some of which I represent. In recent years, we have seen the appointment of an Islands Minister, the Islands Deal, the Islands Bill, and legislation on areas as diverse as the reform of the Crown Estate and the island-proofing of wider policies. These have been very welcome measures, and certain issues will, of course, always feature at the top of the island's political agenda. The success of RET ferry fares and the doubling of the ferries budget since the SNP came to office has meant that there is now an ever-increasing demand for ferry services from both islanders and tourists. Housing remains a complex problem in the islands, though happily the recent offer from the Scottish Government of some £25 million for affordable houses in the Western Isles holds out the prospect of the largest house-building programme there in half a century. Meanwhile, the multiple uncertainties of Brexit hold their own obvious risks for both crofting and fishing communities. And perhaps most urgently of all, we need to remind the rest of Scotland that there are good jobs regularly advertised in the islands, that this is an outstanding place to live, and that new people are needed. So the First Minister's very welcome announcements about rural broadband link many of these distinctive issues together for Scotland's island communities. In mentioning this, I hope that even the most atrophied opposition heart will be able to acknowledge how far things have come. Only 4 years ago, my constituency had no superfast broadband at all. And what is more, there was no prospect whatsoever of this being supplied commercially. Today, after millions of pounds of investment by the Scottish Government, some 75% of homes and businesses in the Western Isles now have access to superfast broadband. Now, before someone intervenes in this, I am very conscious that this is, of course, no comfort at all to the other 25% of islanders who have not yet benefited in this way. I can think of many communities and individuals who are in regular touch with me about this frustrating issue, and I will not try your patience, Presiding Officer, by naming them. But I can think of people in Uig and Lewis, in many parts of South Uist and on the west side of North Uist, as well as on the west coast of Harris, among many others who are keen to see where they now fit into the rollout plan. And that's why the commitment from the First Minister to 100% coverage by 2021 and to a new contract within the coming year for further work is very encouraging. We should all now work together to ensure the success of the R100 contract and to maximise the active involvement of communities in planning ahead to ensure that all islanders, indeed people across Scotland, enjoy the kind of connectivity that most Scots increasingly now take for granted. Presiding Officer, it has been said before that the rollout of broadband today in our own times in rural Scotland and particularly in Highlands and Islands can prove to be as transformative as the rollout of telephone lines were in that part of Scotland in the 1940s and 50s. And there is a new imperative I think we should think about, and that is that we are quickly coming to the point where families are as likely to move to a place without broadband as they would have been in past times to move to a place without telephones. So, Presiding Officer, I believe in conclusion that the programme for government is a commitment to a Scotland where all communities are included, not least our island communities, where all communities benefit economically and where distinctive and differing needs are respected. I welcome the priority which the Government has given to ensuring that island broadband plays its role in doing all those things for ensuring that our island communities are part of Scotland's economic success in the future. And I commend the programme for government as the way to achieve it.
Adam Tompkins, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The summer recess is, of course, an opportunity for us to spend some quality time in the constituencies or regions that we represent. And naturally, I spent mine in Glasgow. From all of the meetings and conversations that I had over the summer, two messages stand out. First, that under the SNP, Scotland's economy is struggling and that the nationalists are out of ideas and indeed even lack the commitment to drive economic growth in the first place. And secondly, that voters are sick and tired of their politicians using Brexit for their own short-term political ends. Indeed, rather than getting on with the job of negotiating the best possible deal in the interests of the country. Both of these themes are wearily familiar, aren't they, in what we heard from the First Minister this afternoon. She couldn't even mention Brexit without banging the drum yet again for independence. But I want to start with the economy, and I'm going to make no apology for focusing these remarks on Glasgow, just as Alistair Allen focused many of his remarks on the area of Scotland that he represents here. Stewardship of the economy is one of the primary responsibilities of government, of any level of government. And we all know that under the SNP, Glasgow's economy is struggling. Business start-up rates, business survival rates, the female employment rate, and levels of economic activity all compare poorly when contrasted with cities in the north of England, such as Manchester. It's a gloomy picture, not least on the once iconic Sauchiehall Street, one of the most important commercial streets anywhere in Scotland, one of Glasgow's major retail arteries, and it is no exaggeration, Presiding Officer, to say that it is dying on the SNP's watch. Hit by two major fires earlier this year, the SNP stood idly by, even as businesses went under and even as residents were locked out of their properties for weeks on end. The SNP's chronic mismanagement of Glasgow's City deal is only making matters worse. The First Minister made great play in her statement this afternoon of the importance of infrastructure investment. But in Glasgow, infrastructure investment that was supposed to boost economic growth is having exactly the opposite effect. As Sauchiehall Street is turned into a building site, shoppers and consumers given every reason to stay away and no reason to return. Some businesses on that street are reporting takings this summer at 1/3 of the level they enjoyed 12 months ago. When Glasgow thrives, Scotland thrives. Glasgow is Scotland's economic powerhouse, and Sauchiehall Street is a major driver of Glasgow's economy, not only in retail, but in food and leisure, and of course in the nighttime economy too. So what engagement has the SNP had with businesses in and around Sauchiehall Street to ensure that City Deal infrastructure investment is being directed appropriately? Asked just this question in the House of Commons in July, the SNP leader of Glasgow City Council, Susan Aitken, said, and I quote, that we don't yet have in the Glasgow region a clear interaction with the business community, unquote. Doesn't that just sum it up, Presiding Officer? The nationalist leader of Scotland's biggest city, a city that 18,000 businesses call home, proudly boasting that her SNP administration has no clear interaction with the business community. No programme for government can hope to grow the Scottish economy while the nationalist leader of Scotland's major city turns her back on business? Perhaps Mr Doris would like to apologise for his leader's remarks.
Bob Doris.
I apologise to any voter that's got to actually listen to you, Mr Tompkins, because you're completely ill-informed at the Glasgow region deal. It's worth putting on record, Mr Tompkins, that the projects in the deal was signed not by Councillor Susan Aiken, but by a previous Labour administration. But the biggest problems our committee found in our City Region Deal inquiry was that the Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council are trying to form inclusive growth projects to bring all of society together with the City Region Deal, something specifically rejected by the UK Government.
Adam Tompkins.
Not quite sure what the question was there, but I certainly didn't hear an apology for the abject refusal of the SNP leadership in the city that both Mr Doris and I represent for refusing to engage at all with the business community. I want to turn, Presiding Officer, to Brexit. This time last year, we stood with the SNP in insisting that Brexit must be delivered compatibly with our devolution settlement. We agreed with the SNP that the withdrawal bill, as it was then before the House of Commons, failed to do this and needed amendment. And in time, of course, that amendment came, although the Scottish Government stood alone among the administrations of the United Kingdom in refusing to accept this. 12 months on, we are still on these benches of the view that Brexit must be delivered compatibly with devolution. But the SNP, I see, has now changed its mind about this. Respecting the devolution settlement means respecting that which is devolved and respecting that which is reserved. And among the matters reserved to Westminster is international trade. Yet, far from respecting this aspect of the devolution settlement, Scottish ministers propose to ignore it entirely. All new proposed trade deals should be subject to not one, but 5 separate Scottish Government vetoes, according to the SNP. A veto at preparation stage, another if the negotiating mandate changes, a third at negotiation stage, another at ratification, and a final veto when the trade agreement is signed. 5 vetoes for Scottish ministers on a reserved matter. That's not respecting the devolution settlement. It's taking a wrecking ball to the Scotland Act. It's a naked nationalist power grab, and it will be robustly opposed.
I call Daniel Johnson to be followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Starting back after recess is always a useful point in time to take stock on the year just gone. Indeed, comparing last year's programme for government and looking at what was actually passed by this Parliament. And this time last year, the spin was ferocious. Bold and ambitious was the mantra splashed across the headlines. And the contrast is telling, because this year feels much more like damage control. Whether it is testing Primary 1 pupils, the British Transport Police, the tourist tax, or John Swinney's flagship education bill, this summer has been punctuated by U-turns, knockbacks to council leaders, and convoluted explanations for government climb-downs. And the summer headlines shouldn't have been a surprise, because last year's programme for government was meant to be bold, but has been defined by what it ditched rather than what it delivered. This government needs to return to clarity and purpose. For too much of the last year, it was a case of carry on regardless, resulting in halts and U-turns. But there was, of course, one U-turn which I very much welcome over the summer, and that was on the British Transport Police. And again, I'd like to repeat my commendation to the new Cabinet Secretary for listening. His predecessors' intransigence in the face of experts, staff, officers, academics, not to say opposition politicians and unions, was in a sense impressive. However, it was misguided and damaging. The dogmatic pursuit of full integration left him in a difficult position, especially as Police Scotland themselves have now stated that at the most recent SPA board meeting that such an objective of full integration would not be possible for years, and that is a direct quote from those board papers. So we need to find a way forward for the devolution of transport policing. The Cabinet Secretary needs to follow up his announcement with clarity that full integration is off the table. It is only by seeking dialogue and consensus and listening to officers, unions and experts that the Minister will receive our backing for his plans. But he also needs to end the uncertainty that the continuing rejection of, or the refusal to outright reject full integration remains for staff and the people that use the service. But I would just like to turn to some of the details set out in the programme for government. I very much welcome the announcement for a focus on victims, whether it's giving evidence or other the impacts of pursuing issues through the criminal justice system. All too often our justice system re-traumatises victims, and I think addressing those issues is important. Likewise, I welcome the announcement that the government will be bringing forward a biometric data bill that follows up the very useful and instructive work carried out by John Scott QC. Likewise, on the disclosure bill and defamation bill, I think it's been very clear in the last year in the evidence that the Justice Committee has taken and elsewhere that there's a need for reform. So we will look at the details of those proposals and we will make constructive engagements and seek to make sure that those bills deliver on the promise that they set out. But there is, of course, business to be carried over from last year. There is the bill from last year that sought to look at parole, electronic tagging and disclosure, the Management of Offenders Bill. And I think that it's fair to say that there's been disappointment in this bill and its lack of ambition. And I think you can see that lack of ambition no more clearly than the fact that the First Minister had to re-announce the fact that the government will be looking at the transparency around parole. That could have been addressed in the Management of Offenders Bill. It is already looking at the parole board. Likewise, the First Minister announced that there will be an examination of remand. Again, that could have been covered for the bill if it wasn't for the careless language in the very title of that bill. And that title is something that has caused issues. The word term offender was something that the Scottish Government had stated that it was no longer going to use. And that is because that word stigmatises those going through the criminal justice system, stigma that can undermine the attempts to break criminal behaviours and the chaotic lifestyles that lead to them. So when we look at the Management of Offenders Bill, I think we see where this government needs to improve. It must seek greater clarity and greater sense of purpose if it is going to improve its assessment this time next year. But I'd also like to mention hate crime. And we welcome the mention in the First Minister's statement that there will be a new bill on hate crime. But I would urge the Scottish Government to come forward with further detail, both in terms of the timing and the scope of what they seek to achieve with this. Lord Bracadale's recommendations, which were published last year, are an excellent example of the very clarity and purpose that I have spoken of in my speech. Discrimination is appalling in all its forms, and hate crime continues to have long-lasting, hurtful and damaging effects for many people in Scotland. And I do understand that the new Cabinet Secretary wants to make this one of his top priorities. So we will closely scrutinise what is brought forward in the bill and look forward to seeing the detail. And where it takes on the recommendations of Lord Bracadale's review, we will support it. But I'd like to close by saying something on consensus and to make these comments across this place. The Cabinet Secretary will have done, as I have over the summer, and spoken to experts and people working in the fields of criminal justice across Scotland. And one thread and one topic of conversation has come up time and time again, and that is the determination to preserve the political and social consensus of this Parliament when it comes to the criminal justice system that we have enjoyed in recent years. That consensus which states that crime should fall, that violent crime can be prevented, that reconvictions are falling, but that imprisonment, and short sentence in particular, are not always the most effective way of reducing crime because of the impact it has and the fact that it can lead to reoffending. Now, I would just gently say this across the chamber, that there seems to be a change in mood, that some parties seem to be wanting to break that consensus for party political gains. My party will hold this government to account. We will tell you when we disagree. We will offer new ideas and we will criticise plans when they are not coherent or not properly thought through. Please. But we need a justice system that works, and that can only be done on the basis of consensus.
Before I call Gillian Martin, can I say we're really pushed for time, and if all requested speakers for today are to make their full contributions, we'll have to be very, very strict and tight. Gillian Martin, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A test of any government's programme is the investment it puts into infrastructure, real, tangible, visible building work as a result of which the economy can be stimulated, services can be improved, communities can thrive and everyday lives can be made better. Infrastructure spend continues to be the backbone of successive programmes for government from this government. Last Wednesday, I welcomed the Deputy First Minister to Inverurie in my constituency, where he was able to see how one of the latest projects in the Scottish Schools for the Future programme is coming along. The Inverurie Community Campus will provide state-of-the-art educational environment for the pupils of Inverurie Academy and St Andrew's School. It will bring secondary school pupils together with pupils with additional support needs in a campus that is purpose-built for all their educational, social and pastoral needs. In the 2 years that I've been an MSP for Aberdeenshire East, I have seen the completion of 3 new school buildings. My former secondary school, Ellen Academy, Market Hill Primary in Turriff and Udyside School in Inverurie. By 2020, it will be 4. In my constituency, broadband has been a major ask. Although this area is reserved to Westminster, the decision by the Scottish Government to intervene has been necessary to ensure that vast swathes of rural Scotland are not left behind. Without the intervention of the Scottish Government, most of my constituency would never have access to superfast broadband. Before the Scottish Government commitment, the percentage of premises connected to fibre broadband in Aberdeenshire through commercial deployment, as predicted in 2012, was just a quarter. Now, after this Government's intervention, today it stands at over 91%, and by 2021, we'll have 100% access. And with the new contract, it won't just be the most remote who get access last. Investment in transport infrastructure is crucial to the economic growth of any country, and in decades before an SNP government, my area of the North East had been badly served in that respect by successive governments. A bypass that would connect the north and south of Aberdeenshire and keep traffic out of Aberdeen City was mooted in the late 1950s. You would have thought that the importance of oil and gas industry to the Scottish and UK economy would have made infrastructure spend like this in the North East a priority of Thatcher's government, but it did not. So in a post-devolution situation, we all expected heaven and earth to be moved to make it a reality. But it took this SNP government to take hold of the project and actually deliver it. All my colleagues will know that the late Brian Adam MSP was instrumental in campaigning for it to happen. The difference the AWPR will make to my constituents will be enormous. It will genuinely change our everyday lives. There will be less congestion, safer journeys and quicker commutes. Communities around Aberdeen will be vastly better connected to the city and to the rest of Scotland, and the economic impact will be substantial. The transport infrastructure spend doesn't end there. The first stage of the dualling of the rail track between Aberdeen and Inverurie is complete, with the Dyce-Aberdeen stretch now open, and I gave it a test on my way down to Parliament. Next year, we'll see a new station at Kintore and a doubling of service between Inverurie and Aberdeen after the investment in a new line. A new railway line, 2 new schools, the building of the country's largest health centre, 100% broadband coverage, dualling of the A96, could Inverurie be an even more attractive place to live. New opportunities for infrastructure investment are opened with the Government's announcement of the Scottish National Investment Bank. Along with my North East colleagues, I will continue to make the economic, environmental and social case for new rail lines to areas that currently don't have a rail option. In my specific case, a line from Dyce to Ellen is something I feel would be a real benefit, and my constituents agree. Of course, being in a very rural constituency, we recognise that cars are always going to be necessary for a great many of us who live away from public transport routes. So it's vital that we provide the infrastructure needed for the use of electric vehicles to be a realistic option. The announcement of the 1,500 new electric vehicle charging points certainly makes my personal goal of a jump from hybrid vehicle to fully electric in the next few years a real possibility. But I cannot sit down without mentioning the announcement that has made me happiest today. At the end of May, in discussion with our backbenchers, the Government were asking for ideas on what could be in the programme for government, and we asked for financial assistance in an area very close to many of our hearts, and that was more spend on early intervention for mental health for young people at school level. I am delighted to hear that the First Minister has taken our views on board and committed this Government to putting counsellors in every secondary school. I think this is one of the most significant educational and health developments of this Government. On behalf of the many parents, teachers and teenagers who've spoken to me about this, I want to say thank you for listening to their views. This is a programme full of substance, realisable ambition and concrete delivery on manifesto commitments, and has the flexibility to adapt new policy. This Government is ambitious for Scotland, and it's one that's tackling the many challenges we face and listens to the country. Year on year, this Government is delivering for the whole of Scotland. I see that in my area every day. I see it in bricks and mortar. I see it in new broadband cabinets, in road crews, in cranes lifting bridge supports into place, in newly laid rail track, and in every journey I take around my constituency of Aberdeenshire East.
I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the programme for government debate is always both exciting and also interesting, and it's also one of those debates that many people actually look forward to. There is anticipation and also the expectation of this SNP government continuing to deliver for the people of Scotland. The fact that the opposition parties today have yet again moaned and groaned with little semblance of any gratitude towards this Scottish Government tells a tale of opposition parties that are bereft of ideas and vision for this country. Instead of moaning and groaning, they should be thanking this Scottish Government for the many achievements and the record of delivery that it has consistently delivered. They should be thanking the Scottish Government for the major infrastructure projects.
Can we quieten down now, please? Not yourself, Mr McMillan. You carry on.
Thank you very much. They should be thanking the Scottish Government for the major infrastructure projects it's delivered and is delivering, such as the completion of the M8, the building of the Queensferry Crossing, the building of the AWPR, and also the work that started on the drilling of the A9, to name just 4 examples. No, you can listen if you want more. These are projects that previous Scottish executives and the Scottish Office before this Parliament did not deliver because of the lack of foresight, vision and desire of the politicians in charge over these decades. They should be thanking the Scottish Government for its record of building over 72,000 affordable homes, including most recently Bay Street and Slimuir Avenue in Port Glasgow in my constituency. They should be thanking the Scottish Government for keeping commercial shipbuilding alive in the Lower Clyde with its continued support and awarding of contracts to Ferguson Marine and Port Glasgow. They should be thanking the Scottish Government for investment in the Attainment Challenge this year of £120 million, with £9.3 million going directly to schools in Inverclyde over the last 3 years. And not forgetting the additional investment in the Schools for Future programme, including paying for half of the newly built St Patrick's Primary School in Greenock in my constituency. They should be thanking the Scottish Government for the continued investment of over £13 billion into the NHS, as well as the £7.3 million invested in the new Orchard View Hospital, which is the Inverclyde Adult and Older Persons Continuing Care Hospital. This was yet another long, drawn-out saga to replace the not-fit-for-purpose Ravenscraig Hospital. There are many more examples, Presiding Officer, but time does unfortunately prevent me from continuing on that particular line. But on the issue of mental health, the announcement today of additional finance and resources to help with the early intervention in our schools and colleges is something I'm sure every member of this Parliament should be welcoming. Investing in additional school nursing to create around 350 counsellors in school education across the nation, as well as ensuring every secondary school has counselling services, is something to be welcomed and supported. Investing in additional 250 school nurses across the country will help provide the response to mild and moderate emotional and mental health difficulties experienced by young people. Investing in 80 additional counsellors in further and higher education over the next 4 years will also greatly help our young people as they progress through their educational journey. Expanding the range of perinatal support available to women will be greatly beneficial to society also. Almost 20% of women will experience mental health during their pregnancy. Therefore, this is yet another example of doing the right thing. Presiding Officer, there have been many concerns raised about the delivery of child and adolescent mental health services, and I'm sure the proposals in this programme for government will assist many people across the country. In addition to the extra counsellors, parents will have a much clearer understanding of the kind of help that's available to them and where and how they can access it. Children and young people having a much wider range of help available to them. Schools will be better supported to deal with wellbeing concerns, and will also be able to direct children to counselling service. And developing services for community mental wellbeing for 5 to 24-year-olds and their parents to provide direct and immediate access to counselling sessions. This new support and investment will have a hugely beneficial effect upon the mental health of our young people, and I think it's actually fitting that this announcement is made in this year of young people. It shows the commitment once again that this Scottish Government have for the future generations of our nation. I want to touch upon one other area now, and that concerns the vision and the direction that this Scottish Government has in comparison to the rudderless and chaotic nonsense coming from Whitehall. When Jackson Carlaw stands up to try to lay the blame of his own party's total incompetence, and then actually has the brass neck to actually try and blame the SNP and get us to try and support his party. But which party is it he wants us to support? Which faction of it? I think actually Jackson Carlaw has probably just now won the annual Herald Brass Neck of the Year award when that comes out later on in the year. But the Tory civil war that's been taking place for months now is proof of the old phrase that we say in Inverclyde: never trust a Tory. There's Theresa May's Chequers plan, which was slammed just as the last person was leaving the building. She's got one side of her party scrambling to cobble together some semblance of a narrative on the EU. She's got the other side who actually want the UK to actually go back to the Victorian era with delusions that Britain actually is still a world power. So this is in contrast to the united and growing SNP, which has now overtaken the Tories to become the second largest party in the UK. Presiding Officer, this programme for government is much to be welcomed. And it does build on the social and the business focus this SNP Scottish Government has delivered, from the initial £2 million, from the additional £2 million to tackle holiday hunger amongst children and the carers allowance supplement, which the First Minister spoke about earlier. There is much to be welcomed, and I certainly commend this programme for government to the Chamber. Thank you very much.
I call Jamie Green to be followed by John McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I should remind Mr McMillan that the Edinburgh Festival has indeed finished, and that comedy speech would have been up for a great award, I have to say. Isn't it quite telling? Isn't it quite telling today? The First Minister did a 40-minute speech. First Minister did a 40-minute speech, and it only took her 2 minutes and 20 seconds to say her favourite word. Guess what it is? Independence. The driver of every policy, every strategy and every programme that emits from her government, and she knows it. Now, to be fair,
down, please.
To be fair, there are some good ideas in here. There are some welcome ideas, and we in these benches have been happy to support some of those. Let's look at legislation that we've passed, that we've worked on together. The Sexual Offences Pardons Bill, the Islands Bill, the Social Security Bill, meaningful pieces of legislation. We've worked in the past and will work with this government on sensible legislation and on tackling important things like FGM, family law, domestic abuse, consumer protection. We will approach those with that same constructive attitude. The First Minister said in Holyrood magazine last week, we must keep focused on moving forward with our domestic agenda. Warm words, First Minister, but words and actions are two very different things. This year's programme for government will have the highest number of bills carried forward from previous years. Over the past 2 years, a raft of bills have simply failed to materialise. In 2016, the Air Passenger Duty Bill. It makes another cameo appearance in this year's commitment, but there's no commitment to see it through. We don't know when or how it will be delivered. And what about last year's programme for government? We made it through only 2 pieces of legislation out of 15. Where is criminal responsibility, warm homes, or tissue donation, the management of offenders? Important pieces of legislation that are still stuck in the machinations of this Parliament. And what about the flagship education bill? Lying in tatters, shelved and criticised, not just politically, but by the sector itself. And we saw the entire machinery of Parliament halted for nearly a month, while MSPs were forced to debate, scrutinise and pass legislation that wasn't even within the competence of this Parliament. So it's no huge surprise that there is a backlog of legislation that we are supposed to get through in the next 2 years. This programme for government will be like every others from the First Minister, full of jargon, action plans with no action, working groups, strategies, even the announcement of a new public body, a host of new bills that are left to collect dust on the tables of civil servants. Key pledges ignored, announced and then ignored again, like tackling drug driving, like Derek Mackay's £36 million Digital Growth Fund, which has seen just £2 million allocated to it. What about the £500 million Growth Fund, which has seen only 5% of that sum invested? And the Scottish Government's another flagship project, R100, was supposed to be completed by 2021. That's now the end of 2021. And today we learned that contracts might be awarded sometime in the next year, leaving so little time to reach Scotland's hardest to reach properties. Every year this government produces glossy 100-page programmes, but it is the everyday issues that matter to people. Just yesterday I got an email from a constituent in Saltcoats. She queued for 45 minutes outside her GP surgery in the rain trying to get an appointment. And that's not a one-off, Presiding Officer. This is systemic, long-term mismanagement of our NHS workforce planning. It is a shambles and it is shameful, Presiding Officer. The unfortunate reality is that no matter what the government says today, no matter what the First Minister promises, the reality will not change. This government will still be letting people down in Scotland today, tomorrow and the days that follow. People will still be being told they need to wait 17 months to see a specialist consultant. Why? Because there are record vacancies for them. Farmers will still be offered loans instead of the funding that's due to them. Why? Because of a botched IT project, which is still not working. Commuters will still be left stranded because the ferry is cancelled. Why? Because there are no ferry vessels available. And the new ones, well, we learn, are a year late. And there will still be young Scots being denied a place at the Scottish university of their choice. Why? Because fee-paying students are preferred and pursued by universities. People will still hear the engaged tone at the end of the line, trying to even get an appointment to see their GP. Why is that? Have a guess. Where in today's jargon-filled promises of working groups and strategies is there any hint or any clue as to how the government is going to address these fundamental issues? The problem is we've heard it all before. There was mention of infrastructure projects, the A9, the Queensferry Crossing, even the M8, AWPR. But these are already policies we knew about. There is nothing new in here, no ideas, nothing radical. And how on earth does the Scottish Government think that if it wishes to eliminate diesel and petrol cars, it is going to do so by just introducing 1,500 charging points to meet the needs of 6 million people? Is that really going to generate the modal shift that we need? But, Presiding Officer, the big elephant in the room that I want to touch on today is this. The First Minister announced £7 billion of additional spend. If I stood up in this chamber and announced billions of pounds of spend, the first thing that would be asked of me is how are you going to pay for it? Is it more taxes? Is it more borrowing? Or is it spending cuts elsewhere? Which is it? Because I think the public have a right to know. And it's not coming from economic growth, Presiding Officer, because the only EU country with GDP growth slower than Scotland is Greece. The Finance Secretary should stand up tomorrow and enlighten us. Is this the First Minister...
No, Mr Green's just closing.
Is this the First Minister that puts the interests of Scotland first or the interests of her party? Judge her by her record, she says. I couldn't agree more.
I call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I want to congratulate the First Minister on this programme for government, not only for the 12 bills it outlines and the new commitments it contains, but because it builds on last year's ambitious programme for government, one of the most radical anywhere in the world. What a contrast with that other government in Westminster, which has been so consumed by Brexit bickering that it often appears to have abandoned the business of domestic governance entirely. As Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, observed yesterday, quote, south of the border, the whole political class is fixated on dealing with the fallout from the Brexit referendum. It's taking up all available attention. This programme for government, by contrast, shows the Scottish Government has a vision for the future, where the UK Government's vision often appears to stop at Dover. Of the 191 divisions held in the Commons in the year following the 2017 Queen's speech, 42% were on the EU withdrawal bill alone. We witness a tale of two governments, the UK Government crippled by internal division and Scotland's Government getting on with the job of improving the lives of our citizens. Just some examples from the last year include £120 million for the Pupil Equity Fund, becoming the first country in the world to implement minimum pricing for alcohol, a comprehensive plan to eradicate child poverty, the £1 billion deal with councils to double early learning and childcare, the world-leading domestic abuse bill, a plan for the National Investment Bank backed by £2 billion, a historic social security bill with dignity and respect at its heart, and of course connecting 900,000 homes to fibre broadband, which I think Alistair Allen eloquently illustrated the transformative effect of Scottish Government policies on his constituency in his illustration of how broadband had changed the lives of people just in the past 5 years. The Scottish Government has been busy. That was the last year alone, and this year's programme keeps up the pace. I particularly welcome the focus in the 2018-19 programme for government on mental health generally and the provision for children and young people in particular. The focus on prevention and early intervention is absolutely correct, and the 60 million for 350 school counsellors and 250 additional school nurses is particularly welcome. And so too is the announcement of 80 counsellors across further and higher education. And on top of that, the 5 to 25 community wellbeing service means that every young person will have access to the counselling and advice that they need wherever they live. The programme's other major focus is the economy and a commitment to invest in our infrastructure, an area in which, as the First Minister pointed out, the UK lags behind the G7. The pledge to increase capital investment by £1.5 billion by 25-26 is exactly the sort of transformational approach that's so absent in Westminster, which, let us not forget, still holds the majority of fiscal powers over Scotland and its economy. Sadly, of course, measures like this are another example of the Scottish Government being forced to clean up Westminster's mess. We know that a no-deal Brexit will wipe £12.7 billion a year from Scotland's economy by 2030 and cost each man, woman and child £2,300 a year. And that research comes not just from the Scottish Government, but it also reflects the UK Government's own figures, as well as independent analysis. Investment in infrastructure is the single most effective way to tackle recession, and Mr Swinney used it very effectively during the last recession after the banking collapse in 2008. With a Brexit recession looming, this investment in infrastructure is an essential intervention. Tearing us out of the single market and the customs union against our will means that more than ever we need to support Scotland's businesses in their exporting ambitions. And this programme, with its export growth plan, sees 20 million invested in a range of measures, including support for the 150 businesses to increase overseas activities. I'd also like to take this opportunity to welcome the Scottish Government's paper on trade, which was published at the end of last week. It emphasises the urgent need for the Scottish Government and this Parliament to obtain an enhanced role in the development of future trade policies. We must be able to influence the preparation, negotiation, agreement, ratification and implementation of future trade deals if we are to protect our devolved public services, ensure the highest standards of environmental and consumer protection in Scotland and help our export businesses. Finally, I want to welcome the news that the first of our new social security payments in Scotland will begin this month, earlier than planned, and that the first Best Start grants for low-income mothers and babies will be paid before Christmas. In some ways, this is the greatest contrast in this tale of two governments. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, who is assuming office, promised to help those who were just about managing, has consistently cut in work benefits. And in April this year, her government cut £2.5 billion from 11 million families across the UK as a result of the cash freeze on working age benefits, the two-child limit, the rollout of universal credit and the cuts that include family support. So while it's true that the UK Government has been bogged down by Brexit, it has not allowed itself to be distracted from its absolute priority, which often seems to be punishing the poor. This programme for government is both aspirational and compassionate. It will deliver for all the people of Scotland, and I commend it to this chamber. Thank you.
I call Colin Smith to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister opened today's debate describing the programme of government as building on the progress of last year. Well, there's no doubt this was a case of more of the same. More cuts to our vital public services, more excuses for not using the full powers of this Parliament to implement real change. And no more so is the timidness of this government clearer than in the measures for Scotland's broken transport system. We have a railway system where fares are rising above wages, where passengers stand on a platform not knowing if their train will even stop, where new trains are already running late before they've even been built. And we have a bus network slowly being dismantled by the SNP route by route, where passenger numbers continue to fall, but bus fares rise and rise and rise by 47% over the past 10 years. The programme of government document published today pledges stability for bus services on the very day the Scottish Government's own transport figures were published that showed a 9.5% decline in bus passengers in the past 5 years alone. Presiding Officer, it isn't stability we need on our buses, it is real change to reverse the decline under this government. And that won't be delivered by the timid transport bill before Parliament. That bill fails to recognise that public transport has become detached from public service and public ownership. It reinforces a broken system where profits, not passengers, are put first. It proposes a franchising model cut and pasted from the UK Tory government that won't allow the public sector to bid for those franchises. Whenever I challenge the Scottish Government to back public ownership of our railways, they refuse. They say they support
Mr.
a public
Yousaf,
sector.
would you please stop shouting across the corridor? Carry on, please, Mr. Smith.
Whenever I challenge the Scottish Government, including Mr Yousaf, to back public ownership of our railways, they refuse. They refuse to back that plan. They say they support a public sector bid for the ScotRail franchise. In fact, the First Minister repeated that pledge today in her statement. It's not full public ownership, but it is a start. So why is it that the First Minister and the Scottish Government and the programme of government say public sector bids for franchises are good enough for our railways, but they are not good enough for our buses? Why are the SNP so determined to let their big bus company owning donors cherry-pick the profitable bus services to run, but they leave local councils to pick up the bill for loss-making services, a bill they simply can't afford? I will indeed, yes.
Stuart Stevenson.
I wonder if Mr Smith would mark the report card for publicly owned Network Rail. It's about how you manage things rather than who owns things that perhaps makes the difference, because I don't think many would give high marks to Network Rail.
Colin Smith.
There's another statement from an SNP politician, again refusing to back full public ownership. We should bring a rail and a track together under public ownership, not keep them apart. Now, here in Edinburgh, we have the successful Lothian Buses model, the best bus operator in Scotland, with levels of satisfaction of the highest in the industry, and where the publicly owned company recently returned £5.5 million to the public purse. So why in the same city do we have a government sit-in that won't allow that successful model to happen anywhere else in Scotland? Presiding Officer, it's often said that the SNP pretend to be left but act right. But when it comes to transport, this programme of government shows they don't even pretend. So when the Scottish Government bring forward the transport bill this term, Labour will set out our alternative of real change. We'll put forward amendments to that bill to deliver radical re-regulation of our buses and proper municipal ownership, where the public sector can run services, not be banned from doing so. Our amendments will also mean that when changes in bus routes are proposed by bus companies, it will require proper consultation with passengers and agreement by transport agencies. Our re-regulation proposals will also put a stop to rip-off fares, ending the postcode lottery that exists, in particular when it comes to concessionary travel for young people, and driving forward multi-operator ticketing. Imagine the boost in bus passenger numbers if free bus travel was extended to, for example, young people starting with modern apprenticeships. Labour's amendments will also halt the race to the bottom in the way staff are treated by proposing measures to work towards a collective bargaining model that drives up, not down, workers' terms and conditions on our buses. The Government will then be left with a very clear choice: to work with Labour to end the dismantling of Lifeline bus routes, or drive through their timid transport bill with the help of the Tories and continue to preside over not stability on our bus network, but its continued decline. But it's not just in our transport system that I hope the Government will work with Labour to strengthen proposals in the timid programme of government in areas that I shadow. As someone who's campaigned for 10 years for more support for the South of Scotland economy, I welcome the long overdue legislation to establish the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency, ironically a decade after the Scottish Government abolished local enterprise agencies in Dumfries and Galloway and the Borders. But that legislation must ensure the membership of the agency is rooted in the South of Scotland, with powers to deliver real change both in enterprise and skills, and with a budget to deliver that change. And it must be backed with investment and a Borderlands growth deal in this year's budget. The First Minister also pledged in her statement to eradicate holiday hunger, but the sad reality is children across Scotland go to bed hungry at night all year round. But disappointingly, I see no mention in the programme of government to a Good Food Nations bill and a commitment to introduce a legally binding right to food. Finally, I want to touch briefly on the issue of animal welfare. The proposal to create an Animal Welfare Commission is a helpful step. Action to strengthen licensing and regulation of animal sanctuaries and breeding is long overdue. The adoption of Finn's Law is welcome, but I hope that will be backed with an increase in maximum sentences to 5 years for animal cruelty, as campaigned for by animal welfare charities such as Batterdee's Dogs Home. But where is the commitment to a proper ban on hunting? Where is the pledge to end live animal exports? As Richard Leonard said earlier Where is the real radical vision in this programme for government? It was, Presiding Officer, more of the same, and that is a real missed opportunity.
Call Bob Doris to be followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by very much welcoming the First Minister's programme for government presented here this afternoon, pick out some areas of particular interest to myself. And can I start by commending the Scottish Government infrastructure strategy with regards to housing, and let's place that in some context. 76,500 affordable homes built by this government since 2007, over 52,700 of those council or housing association homes. And the current target, of course, is 50,000 within the lifetime of this Parliament, 35,000 minimum for social rent. Now, that has been a step change with a huge and critically a multi-year budgeted financial commitment by the Scottish Government, around £1.7 billion over a 3-year period. And it's in that context that I welcome the commitment by the Scottish Government to increase the annual infrastructure budget by 1% of GDP by 2025. That could mean an additional £1.5 billion each year by then, but also an extra £7 billion over the period running up until 2025. Now, I know, Presiding Officer, that there were many calls for that expenditure. I think Alistair Allen gave a powerful reason to better connect his constituency in relation to broadband infrastructure. But I do think it's important to maintain the strong, high level and multi-year budgets for housing also. And I can tell you, Presiding Officer, the confidence, the significant confidence that's giving the current affordable housing budgets and the multi-year budgets has given the local authority in Glasgow, where I represent constituents, and to the housing associations in my constituency. Also, I can see the difference in how they carry themselves and how they act. With work about to commence, or already undertaking work commenced in Hamilton Hill, in my constituency, in Milton, in Rockhill, in Cawdor, in Summerston, in Postle Park, in Springburn, in Germiston, and there's probably others I've missed out. There's a huge infrastructure development in the communities that I represent. My call, of course, is that we find a way of maintaining that momentum because of the level of need that's out there, but it's very welcome that action has been taken, and the new infrastructure investment is a real opportunity to go even further in the good work that has been done. So that would be something I would ask the Government to consider. In relation to mental health, I think it's fair to say that's been a challenging brief for the Scottish Government, and I therefore very much welcome the announcements around 350 school counsellors and 250 school nurses, so that every school can have a proper, robust school counselling facility within it, and 80 additional counsellors for further and higher education. And I also welcome the task force on children and young people's mental health report, not published yet, of course, by Dr Denise Coya, who's chairing that, but out in the autumn. But the First Minister has decided to take action before the full report is out, and that's to be welcome as well. So not just the counselling service, of course, but also the Scottish Government announcement of the development of a community mental wellbeing service for 5 to 24-year-olds, amongst a variety of other things. But I would like to set that investment beside the £750 million attainment challenge over the lifetime of this Parliament, and in this year alone, the £120 million pupil equity fund to be spent tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. There's clearly a correlation between the mental health and well-being and the nurturing of our young people and their educational attainment also. There's clearly a direct link there. And it's also in that context that I mentioned that I work very closely with Homestart Glasgow North West in my constituency, whose focus is more on pre-5s. I do commend the Scottish Government and its work in relation to pre-5s, whether it's the baby box, whether it's the recent announcement about additional mental health support for new mums, whether it's family nurse partnerships, whilst it's the significant step change in childcare, whether it's the early rollout of the Best Start grant. There's lots of good news stories to tell. But there's a feeling that, the 5+ age group is getting that key attainment support. And I know our government is about early intervention, and we always have an early intervention. I've mentioned some of those things. I know Homestart are thinking about how the Pupil Equity Fund could be used imaginatively to support pre-5s also before they even get into primary one. So when you set beside the superb progress we're going to make in mental health in secondary schools. When you look at the PEF monies in primary and secondary schools, and you look at some of the other early intervention stuff that's been done, there's perhaps a real opportunity to think about widening out PEF to preschools, not in nurseries necessarily, but organisations like Home Start themselves who could carry forward some key initiatives in that area. In the time that I have left, Presiding Officer, I want to welcome the Family Law Bill and thank the previous Minister, Annabel Ewing, in relation to this. I raised concerns in relation to family contact centres, which are unregulated. There's no particular quality control in relation to the performance that the service that they provide. Mums and dads, I have to say, some do superb jobs, but my experience is some just simply do not. And their recommendations hold powerful sway over sheriffs and courts. And I think it's an area the government has to look at as part of the Family Law Bill. I congratulate our new Minister, Ash Denham, to her new role in that area. I know it's an area that she has a high degree of knowledge and interest in, and I look forward to working in partnership in relation to that, but I do think progress has to be made. So just 3 things I've picked out from an exciting programme for government where I think we can deliver for Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I call Maurice Golden to be followed by Mike Russell, who will be the last speaker in the debate today. Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I'd like to declare an interest with respect to my work in the waste sector. Tackling climate change is rightly embedded at the heart of the decision-making processes that influences all areas of policy. We welcome the Scottish Government's ambition, but we are concerned at the lack of progress in a number of key areas. My comments today should be
Hello? I'm live. Okay. Okay. Today we are in Edinburgh. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has announced the new programme for government at Holyrood here. And there were some leading areas on this programme about infrastructure, health, climate change, education, justice systems, progressive system of income, among many other topics. The Scottish Government has announced investment of £7 billion on infrastructure, schools, hospitals, transports, digital connection, clean air and clean energy. And has announced also different increase in budgets, specifically for low carbon transport, with targets that set the Scottish Government with very clear ambitions as having a carbon neutral country by 2050. Other areas where there would be more increase on budget would be on clean energy. So 17 billion pounds have been allocated to pay for 1,500 new electric charge points for green buses, and all these targets, Nicola Sturgeon has insisted that could be under the threat of Brexit, but the Scottish Government has announced that they will still keep going and committed to all these targets. Also, the Scottish Government has announced a new economic plan that will be announced in more detail in October, in which it will outline different ambitions, such as splitting the zero-hour contracts. The Scottish Government also aims for investing 1% of the GDP in infrastructure, and Scotland also will be more represented in Europe with different offices in Berlin, Dublin, Ottawa, and Paris. And finally, the Scottish Government also has set out an ambitious plan to invest in mental health care, and then the debate, the different leaders of the opposition parties, they have basically said that these targets were really good, they were quite ambitious, but they should be looking at how they were delivered. So right now I have a representative of the SNP James Gorman.
James Gorman.
James Gorman, sorry. So, what do you think about this new plan for government?
Clearly, it's a continuation of last year's programme for government, but that's always what it was meant to be. It's about making sure that the things that we said were never going to be a one-year programme last year, and we've continued on that. But there's some really, really good news in there. The extra funding for mental health, the counsellors that are going to be in every second school. It's just fabulous news for all those young children that suffer from stress and all sorts of other anxieties that are now with school, but I'm taking them to school.
And what do you think about the targets that are set in the environmental agenda? Do you think will they be easy to deliver and easy to achieve?
One of the great things, I would say this, of course, I'm a member of the governing party, but one of the great things about the Scottish Government is that they have never taken easy targets. They've taken difficult to achieve targets. And if they even don't get to those targets occasionally, then they've still achieved something that no other government before them in Scotland has ever done. So the targets are difficult to achieve, but they are achievable, and the Scottish Government are determined that that's what's going to happen.
One of the points that is being highly criticised during the debate by the opposition was the increased tax system. What is your take on that?
I was very disappointed by the tone of the opposition leaders, particularly Ruth Davidson. It took her 6 minutes before she mentioned the programme for government. It was a rant that was just critical on everything we've done, but she supported a lot of it. So I'm afraid I'm struggling to take any of the criticism very seriously at this point. Let's see 6 months down the line, a year down the line, if any of the criticisms, and to be honest, I can't even remember them because they were smothered with just anti-SNP words. If any of those criticisms but I doubt it, and I doubt very much that they would be able to do any of their names well as we've done.
And the First Minister also mentioned that some of these targets could be threatened by also that scenario. What do you think? I would say this could be really another threat.
Brexit threatens everything. It threatens the health service, it threatens our education system, it threatens everything. And we have got a government in Westminster, supported by the puppets down here, that will do whatever it is that they want. There's no recognition, or many criticisms of the government get, there's no recognition of the impact of the decisions that they're making down there are making to us. And there's no doubt that the Scottish Government have taken Brexit into account with some of the decisions they've made today. But if it wasn't for Brexit, we could have went further some of the things that some of the great announcements that we've already done today. Of course, Brexit is an impact.
More supporting health, mental health policies and programs, as one of the big announcements today in this program. What do you think? What is going to be the bigger challenge to implement business programs?
The rolling out of it has to be done as soon as possible. There has to be, obviously, what's happening is we're creating council positions in schools. It's just fantastic news, but we have to make sure that those are in place. But we're really pleased to see those. At the same time, as the government are looking to put the councillors in place, they're also going to be training teachers to recognise the signs of mental health, to have almost like a mental health first aid toolkit to hand to make sure that they can either help the child or point the child in the right direction to make sure that they get the assistance they need. This is, for me, this is probably the highlight of the programme for government today. I think it's a fantastic announcement and put the money in there to back it up.
And finally, what do you expect from the opposition in terms of backing up some of your targets?
We'll back some of the things that we're doing, but if history has anything to do with it, in many cases where it's now they're saying we will support you if you're doing this, they will find a reason not to support it. We've seen it with a number of things that's been happening over the last few years, where they've come out and said, yes, we support this, and then a comma was in the wrong place, and they decided that that meant that they couldn't support it. They will oppose. That's what these opposition parties do. They oppose, they never come up with anything constructive, and I can see nothing changing in the protocol to change that.
Thank you very much. Okay, that was James Dorman from the SNP, and we will have more interviews with different representatives of the opposition parties.
effect on our economic prosperity. That is the Tory fault. And the best thing we can do is to be absolutely clear about that and what would serve our interests. Because first of all, we remain clear that Scotland's interests, the interests of the government delivering this programme, the interests of the people of Scotland would be best served by continued membership of the EU in line with the overwhelming wishes of the people of Scotland. But we're also pragmatists. So in December 2016, we were the first administration in the UK to set out, in Scotland's place in Europe, a detailed policy blueprint that would minimise the damage of withdrawal. We set out how, short of remaining in the EU, continued membership of the single market and the customs union is the best solution for Scotland and the UK as a whole. And we're determined to maintain a Scotland that's fair, prosperous, open and tolerant. But we'll go on insisting that Scotland is treated properly in this process. During this recess, Presiding Officer, the UK Government's no-deal technical notices presented an extraordinary picture of what Brexit could mean in practice for businesses and the people of Scotland. Now, we have a duty to prepare for all possible scenarios, but we cannot disguise the outcomes of some of them. But the process of Brexit also has profound implications and threats for this Parliament. We've already seen those threats in recent events. The UK Government proceeded with the Withdrawal Act, despite this Parliament refusing legislative consent. The Act gave ministers the power to change the powers of this Parliament without our consent. During the passage of the Withdrawal Act, we saw that this Parliament was against that happening, and still it happened. In July, the Supreme Court, the UK Government mounted an argument that would have extended the reservation of international relations. So the threats are clear and obvious. Centralisation in Whitehall and Westminster, extending readings of reservations, claims based on the widest reading of international responsibilities, and of course the so-called defence of the so-called UK single market. Now, we will protect this Parliament and the devolution settlement that the people of Scotland voted for in 1997 from such threats. There is a need, however, to continue to change devolution. No one will be surprised if I say the best way forward would be independence. But there's a need to strengthen the current arrangements for the conduct of intergovernmental relations across the UK. Indeed, that has been recognised by the Joint Ministerial Committee and the UK Government, though they're doing precious little about it. So let me, Presiding Officer, help them along a bit. The experience of Brexit has shown there are strong arguments for extending the devolution settlement, not limiting it. In areas of acute concern for Scotland, including immigration, protection of employment and other rights, the development of future UK trade arrangements, there is a need for change. We'll argue for it in this year and in future years. Much has changed since 1974. That has not been recognised by the Conservatives. We set out a comprehensive assessment of the constitutional implications of withdrawal in Scotland's place in Europe. We made proposals, for example, the granting of legal personality to allow us to secure international arrangements. There is now an urgent need to return to a serious consideration of the constitutional implications of Brexit, the powers this Parliament needs to protect and advance the interests of the people of Scotland, whatever our eventual constitutional position. This programme for government is indeed impacted by Brexit, but not defined by it. But the work of this Parliament over the next year will undoubtedly feel the effect of the Tories' Brexit, the Tories' internal dispute, which is damaging all of us.
Thank you very much. And the debate on the Scottish Government's programme for government 2018 to 2019 will continue tomorrow. And I would remind members, if they have spoken in the debate, that they should be in for the closing speeches on Thursday. Now, the next item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion 13703 in the name of the First Minister on the appointment of a junior Scottish Minister. Members should note that the question on this motion will be put immediately after the debate. And I would invite any member who wishes to speak in this debate to press their request to speak button now, and I call on Nicola Sturgeon to speak to and to move the motion in her name.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I turn to the ministerial appointment, can I take this opportunity to clarify a point from my programme for government statement? I referred to this weekend's opening of the AWPR, or a major section of the AWPR. I want to make clear that the opening event is this weekend and it will open to traffic in the coming weeks. However, it remains the case that the whole road will be open to traffic in the autumn of this year. I simply wanted to make that clear to the Chamber. Presiding Officer, I now rise to seek Parliament's approval that Richard Lochhead MSP be appointed as a Scottish Junior Minister. This will of course not be the first time that Richard has held ministerial office, and during his time in government previously he had a number of notable achievements. He was a tireless champion of Scottish rural industries, both at home and abroad, as well as being instrumental in driving the growth of our food and drink sector, which of course continues to go from strength to strength. And on the very day that the Programme for Government confirms plans to ban plastic cotton buds, we should remember that the first steps to tackle plastic waste were taken when Richard implemented the plastic bag levy, which has been a huge success, raising millions of pounds for good causes and seeing plastic bag use plummet. Richard, of course, took a step back from government in 2016 to support his family in an extremely difficult time, and all of us are very pleased that he now feels ready to return to the front bench. Of course, Richard being Richard, he remained a campaigning politician, never wavering in standing up for his constituents. Particularly on the issue of delivery charges, Richard has led a highly effective campaign, highlighting the UK Government's continued failure to act on what is a significant injustice, not only for his constituents, but for rural communities across Scotland, and forcing action by companies, by the Advertising Standards Agency and Trading Standards. Subject to Parliament's approval later this afternoon, I have asked Richard now to take up the role of Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science. His new portfolio is one of the most important in government in terms of building our long-term success. Amongst other things, he will be responsible for the key Scottish Government priority of widening access to university, where we're already seeing improvements on our journey towards 20% of university students coming from the 20% most deprived areas. He will also help to shape the future of our higher education institutions, a pivotal part of our economic future, and he's perfectly placed to work with both sectors, being a graduate first of college and then returning to his studies at university later on. So, Presiding Officer, it will give me great pleasure to welcome Richard Lochhead back to government, and I hope that MSPs from across the Chamber will wish him well in what is a very important job. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you. I now call on Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Richard Lochhead is one of the few remaining 99ers in the Scottish Parliament, a parliamentary veteran and no stranger to the government benches. A native of Paisley in my own region in the west of Scotland, but like many Scots before him, he has travelled far from the place of his birth. He seemed determined to win the constituency, or at least see as much of the north of Scotland as he possibly could. Standing in Gordon in 1997, Aberdeen Central in 1999 and 2003, before winning Murray in 2006, although by this time he had already served as a regional MSP in the north of Scotland for 7 years. He previously served as Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and the Environment, and in that capacity I worked with him promoting the sale of compost bins. And together we sold over 1 million compost bins to households throughout Scotland. There is a picture of each of us inside a compost bin, which was part of the promotional campaign. And when you say that, you wonder how we managed to shift 1 million of those, but never mind. I do have the photo, but I'm not sure which one of us would lose most political credibility were I to release it to social media. Of course, Richard Lochhead is a champion of the circular economy, and in that regard, we are both kindred spirits. His new portfolio is also a critical one, driving forward education and learning, and I know he will work hard, as he was named joint 4th hardest working MSP this summer by Philip Sim. We might be opponents, but in this endeavour of improving education, I genuinely wish him well.
Thank you very much. The question is that motion 13703, in the name of the First Minister, on the appointment of a junior Scottish Minister be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The motion is agreed. The First Minister may now invite Her Majesty to approve the appointment of Richard Lochhead as a junior Scottish Minister, and may I offer my congratulations on your reappointment. Now, the Next item of business is consideration of 3 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I ask Graham Day, on behalf of the Bureau, to move motion 13735 on variation to business motion procedure, motion 13736 on committee meeting times, and motion 13737 on committee membership?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I propose to ask a single question on all 3 Bureau motions. Does anyone object? No, that's good. The question, therefore, is that motions 13735, 13736 and 13737 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And that concludes decision time. We'll now move to members' business. We'll just have a short break, short suspension while the business clears, chamber clears.
The final item of business is a members' business debate on motion 13532 in the name of Bill Kidd on Glasgow and Berlin's successful European Championships 2018. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Bill Kidd to open the debate. Mr Kidd, 7 minutes or thereabout, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Today, I would like to bring the Glasgow 2018 European Championships forward for debate in the Scottish Parliament. The inaugural championships were based between Glasgow and Berlin from the 2nd to the 12th of August of this year. First of all, I'd like to congratulate all the medallists from whichever country they came, but with particular note to Scottish gold medalists Laura Muir, Ailish McColgan, Grace Reid and Duncan Scott, and with further note to silver and bronze medalists James Wilby, Katie Archibald and Jack Carlin. This contributed towards Team GB and Northern Ireland ranking 2nd place in the championships and winning the most medals overall. I'm sure these inaugural championships will be followed by many more, and I hope that they return again soon to Scotland.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon. We are today at Holyrood, where the plan for government has been announced by the First Minister. So today in the plan for government there were different. I'll do that later because James is here now, Linda. So I think we should repeat the interview. Hello. Okay. So, Linda, we have to. We are today in Edinburgh at Holyrood, where the plan for government has been announced by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Different areas such as investment in infrastructure, education, the environmental agenda, the different targets to reduce the carbon emissions have been announced by the Scottish Government with the different budgets allocated to all of these areas. Particularly, one of the announcements has stand out of all this program. Particularly, £7 billion will be allocated on infrastructure, on already existing programs and new programs that will come ahead. So this budget is going to be invested in the schools, hospitals, transport, digital connectivity, and the target of achieving clean energy by 2026. One of the areas where the Scottish Government has emphasised its ambitions to reduce carbon emissions is being the horizon of 2050, where Scotland aims for being a carbon neutral country. Some of these breakdowns for this budget shows also a clear commitment for electric car. In particular, £17 million will be allocated to 1,500 new electric charge points for green buses, and sorry, Linda, yeah, don't put me live now. Okay, Linda, hello. Okay, so I'll start here. I'll start again.
Landscape which offers bountiful opportunities for mountain walking, biking, hiking, bouldering and shinty playing. If you can't yet embrace swimming the length of Loch Lomond, you could at least try kayaking or sailing there. Perhaps you could explore the hidden gems and beautiful beaches that can be found across Scotland's 10,000 kilometres of coastline. Now, due to major international sporting events leaving their footsteps in new venues, there is a growing number of world-class sports centres available for our constituents to enjoy. Not only do we have Europe's largest climbing centre, the EICA in Ratho outside of Edinburgh, we now have the Glasgow BMX Centre in Knightswood, part of my constituency, mentioned for the third time, so I think they are due me a wee training run on the BMX bikes. The BMX Centre in Knightswood, 5 times, is a good example of the active legacy which comes directly from last month's European Championships. The creation of a facility for this budding sport, which was officially adopted by the Olympics in 2008, provides essential space.
We are at Holyrood in Edinburgh after the Scottish Government has announced its plan for government for 2018-2019, and the debate is just finished, and we have one representative of the SNP, James Dormer.
Good afternoon.
So, James, what do you think of the different targets that have been announced today? How ambitious do you think they are to have an effective delivery for this upcoming year?
Yeah, there's a number of ambitious targets, but they're all targets that the Scottish Government are confident they can achieve, and given our past record, then I've got no doubt that we will achieve them.
In particular, one of the areas that's been highlighted is to reduce carbon emissions and to increase the budget and the investment on electric cars and electric buses. How do you think that is going to be implemented soon?
Yeah, I think it's very exciting, and particularly the money has been made available to make sure that public authority vehicles are electric. So they're taking the first steps towards what's going to be a really radical change in the way that public transport and transport in general is delivered. So I'm very excited by it.
Some of the representatives in the opposition, they thought that this was quite an overly ambitious target to achieve. What would you say to them?
I would say that they always think they're overly ambitious, but of course that tends to be because they completely lack ambition themselves. What we do is we can set ourselves high targets, and then we strive to attain these high targets. It's a very easy thing to set easy targets and then achieve them, but you've not really achieved anything majorly. So I think the way we're dealing with it is the right way. I think that the way the opposition are dealing with it is the way that they always do.
One of the other big announcements is the representation of Scotland in other countries, and new offices are going to be open this year.
Yes.
How do you envision that?
It's just part of the move towards Scotland being recognised as a country in its own right. I mean, we can't use the word embassies. We're not allowed to use the word embassies, so we use the word hubs or offices. And I think that what we find here is the more that people get to speak to the Scottish Government and the businesses of Scotland, the more excited they become by the opportunities that are here, and that Scotland are going to benefit from these offices wherever they are.
Another controversial area in the debate is the programs for education to improve staffing at the schools. And your party has announced a new program to give more power to the teachers. How do you think the new regulation is going to improve the responsibilities, the way that the schools are managed?
I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, the Scottish Government had started on this path last year, and I think it makes perfect sense for head teachers to be given control of their school environment, because at the end of the day, he knows better about what's going on in particular schools, because not all schools are the same than the people who work in the school and who run the school, and that's head teachers with the support of the teachers and staff. So I think it's a very sensible idea, and I'm delighted to see that it looks like local authorities are on board.
Another of the announcements has been to invest more and to deliver more mental health programs and to look more after people who suffer from mental health at a very early age. What do you think is going to be the real challenge to deliver these new programs at the schools?
Okay, before I talk about the challenges, I just want to say that this is the most exciting part of Bramford Government for me. It's the part that could have the longest lasting impact on the people of Scotland. If we can get councillors into schools at that early stage, make sure that the support that they need is there for them when they need it, when they're young, then I think it's just incredible news for the children, their families, and for the future of the people of Scotland. And of course there's challenges in getting 350 councillors, which is going to be one in every second secondary school, I think, or one in every second school, which is just fabulous. But while the good thing about what the Scottish Government are doing is that while these challenges are there, they're going to be training teachers to make sure that they, almost like a mental health first aid kit, so they'll be able to recognise the signs of young people who are affected by mental health. I think it's extremely exciting, incredibly positive, and probably for me the best thing to come out of this programme for government.
One of the areas that is being highly criticised by the opposition, particularly by the Tories, is being your increased tax system. How would you justify the need of reforming the tax system?
Yeah, you know, the Tories are always concerned with tax because it's going to affect their pals. They're never really interested in tax when what it's for is for the benefit of those at the bottom end of the scale. They're really interested in tax when it shows at the top end of the scale that you might have to pay a wee bit more. So I do not take the Tories seriously at all when it comes to talking about tax. You look at the record, I do not think that they would be taken seriously when it comes to taxation.
Finally, to conclude, James, the First Minister has said that some of these targets could be under the threat by the post-scenario after Brexit. Which areas do you think will be the most sensitive to Brexit?
Everything. The truth is everything. The Brexit affects the health service badly. I mean, it could have a huge impact on waiting times. The Scottish Government have done incredibly well to be the best part of the UK in terms of waiting times. And I've got no doubt that one thing that will continue is that we'll be the best part of the UK when it comes to the health service. But nobody can pretend that Brexit is not having an impact already on the NHS staff. And it's the same thing with education, particularly further education and others. People are made to feel unwelcome here. We're not going to get the people that we need to make Scotland the country that it can be. And I'm really concerned with Brexit. So for me, I would say that health and education are the two areas of interest that I have that I think will be most affected by Brexit, unless we can manage to work some way of staying within the single market and still having those relationships with the European countries that we have in the EU, and which the Tories have spent the last 2.5 years destroying and criticising everybody else for the failings of the European government.
Thank you very much for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
Okay. So this has been the opinion of James Dolman from the SNP. We will be interviewing other representatives from the different parties here at the Parliament, so stay with us and we will have other interviews.
An opportunity to look at legacy, to review the class of 2014 and see what has changed and what has developed. Now we have, without question, we have world-class performers. And we had 47 Scots in the GB team across 7 sports, and the medals came for those Scots. Now, I am unashamedly massive big fan of Laura Muir, and she underlined her huge talent with her dominant performance in winning her first outdoor title. And I would like to say that I take my training squad along now and again to the indoor facility in Glasgow at the Emirates there, where she trains often, and she always takes the time out to speak to. I've got a little group of 10-year-olds that I work with. She always takes time after training to go along and speak to them. So I think that she's a model of how international sports people should be. Elise McColgan won a fantastic silver in the 5K, and following on from her mother and her mother's footsteps, and she's actually very close to her mother's times, and let's hope that she emulates her. I want to make a special mention to Ailey Doyle, who once again made her way onto the podium, and I think that is now her sitting at 18 major medals, the most by any Scottish athlete, and in that 4x4 team, also young Zoe Clark, who I had the pleasure of working with as an under-15 and under-17. Duncan Scott and his 3 gold medals and a silver in the pool, which I witnessed some of that. And I think I did mention after the Commonwealth, watch out for Jake Whiteman. And he's got a fantastic future ahead of him, and he took a bronze medal in there. What I wanted to highlight actually is in a time, I'm at 4 minutes already, and I've got halfway through my flipping speech. I just wanted to say that the journey that the world-class athletes have been on, and to thank the clubs, the national governing bodies, the coaches, and the funding from local, from early on and locally, to the funding that goes through Sport Scotland, till they reach that elite funding at UK sport level, and that's a £13.2 million into Scottish elite sport at the highest levels of sport. And these are fantastic successes, and I just want to say, may it long continue. May we continue to bring elite sporting events to Scotland, and hope that inspires the next generation. Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. I call James Kelly to be followed by Annie Wells, the last speaker. Mr Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Like the other speakers, can I place on my record my thanks to Bill Kidd for bringing this debate forward tonight. I think it's right in the first week back that we do use some time to reflect back on the success of the championships, because we had a couple of debates in the run-in to the championships, and we discussed a lot of the issues around them, and there was a lot of hope and optimism, but there was also some discussion around legacy. So I think, although this is a members' debate, it's right to take this time to reflect back on the championships that were recently held. I want to place on record my thanks to the organisers and all the volunteers who it wouldn't have been possible for the championships to even be held, might be such a success if it hadn't been for so many volunteers. It was quite a kind of striking image in the run-in, the few days run into the events, that people started to crop up around Glasgow with their tracksuits on, proudly wearing them, the volunteers. And if you met them in the street, they were delighted to tell you where they were volunteering at. I met one woman in a street near to me who was working at Toll Cross, and she told me all about her day and how much she enjoyed it. And you could see how much that woman got out of it, but you can see how they all got a lot out of it, and they put a lot into it, so we should be thankful of that. I want to congratulate all the medal winners. The motion's right to highlight Berlin as well as Glasgow, and I want to reiterate what Brian Whittle said about Laura Muir. I thought that was a fantastic performance, and it was really great to see Laura Muir strike the front from so far out in that 1500 metres race. Sometimes these races can be tactical in nature, and people, wait until the last couple of 100 metres. But she, a really gutsy performance, went right to the front from a long way out and just took it on and won comfortable in the end. So that was a fantastic performance. I also want to highlight Kirsty O'Brien, who's a member of Cambuslang Harriers, and got a silver medal in the triathlon for the over 35 group at Strathclyde Park. And that sets an example, not just to those in Cambuslang Harriers, but throughout the Cambuslang and Glasgow region. I think the Glasgow itself really done itself proud. As Sandra White said, the crowds outweighed what we expected. There was, a fantastic atmosphere when you went into the city at night, or you went in to take on any of the events. Like Brian Whittle, I took in the cycling at Glasgow Green. And what really struck me about it, going to it, was the sheer endeavour of the athletes. I decided to try and enter into the spirit of it, in terms of some sporting participation. I always go out a run on a Sunday morning. So what I did was I watched the start of the cycling, which starts at 10:30 on the Sunday morning. I ran from Cambuslang into Glasgow Green, which is about 4 miles. I watched a good bit of the cycling, and then I ran back home about 2:30, and I watched the finish at 4:30. So it was 6 hours that cycle race was on. And it was that was in the kind of final Sunday. The weather was good throughout, but on that occasion it was pouring with rain, and it was astonishing to see as they came round lap after lap, the effort that they were putting in. But you could also see how much the crowds were getting out of that. So, in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, it's been a great event, a great success. I think it is very important that we look at the legacy. There remain challenges in Glasgow in terms of the city's health, life expectancy, and illnesses remain a major challenge. But I think the platform that the European Championship gives us, in order to try and get more people into sport, is an opportunity which we should all promote and unite around.
Thank you very much. I call Annie Wells.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and thank you to Bill Kidd for bringing this to the Chamber this evening. No one was more excited to hear that Glasgow was once again hosting a major sporting event this summer than me. Unfortunately, I was on holiday for the whole lot of it and didn't get to see it. But it was continuing success of the 2014 Commonwealth Games, and the European Championships again caught the spirit of the city, showcasing Glasgow's infamous hospitality and the warmth of its people. As the host of the first ever European Championships, Glasgow again opened its doors to sporting fans from across the world. Jointly hosted by Glasgow and Berlin between the 2nd and 12th of August, the new multi-sport event was the amalgamation of several existing championships, with Glasgow leading the way in aquatics, cycling, gymnastics, rowing and the triathlon. Thousands of visitors came to the city during August, and with blanket coverage by the BBC and other major broadcasters in Europe, it's estimated the TV audience reach exceeded 1 billion viewers. In reflecting on the success of the championships, it's clear to see that Glasgow once again was the perfect host. With a buzz in the city and an atmosphere of friendliness and goodwill, the event provided perfect opportunity for everyone to get involved. And as well as the 4,500 athletes competing from 52 countries, thousands of volunteers from across the world took part in helping out, including representatives from every Scottish local authority. Music, art, dance, theatre and comedy events were going in conjunction with the championships, and this added a carnival atmosphere to the occasion, providing the opportunity for Glasgow to showcase its creative culture and bring together communities. And to top it all off, Britain came second overall behind Russia on the overall medal table, with Scottish athletes winning 20 of the 74 Team GB's medals. With Scottish tourism worth more than £11 billion to the economy, the championships will no doubt give a boost to the country's visitors' economy. Visit Scotland spoke of the role of the event would play in providing a platform to showcase what Scotland has to offer, attracting tourists to visit Glasgow's historical and contemporary cityscapes and the beautiful and dramatic landscapes that surround it. As Scotland's largest city, Glasgow has so much to offer, and I'm extremely pleased to see that due to events like this, in time will be rightly recognised as one of Europe's most exciting destinations to visit. And finally, as with all sporting events, I hope to see that the championships will increase Scotland's worldwide sporting reputation and encourage people to take part in more physical activity, including myself. And as I've already mentioned, with Scotland winning over 25% of Team GP's total medal tally, Scotland is doing amazing in these sports, and it's something we need to milk for all it's worth. We are doing great in terms of the elite sports, and there's no doubt about it. But this is something that needs to filter down to everyone in Scotland, so regular sport and activity for all levels becomes a societal norm. With regards to that, I would like to take the opportunity to ask the Scottish Government what fresh approaches it will take to tackle Scotland's obesity crisis and improving current rates of physical activity. And to finish today, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'd again like to congratulate Glasgow on its impressive hosting of the inaugural European Championships. What has been shown time and time again during the hosting of sporting events is that they are time when people can come together and celebrate in unity. Glasgow has so much to offer, and again we've seen this. The Championships have not only consolidated Scotland and Glasgow's sporting reputation worldwide, but most importantly, they showcased Glasgow and Scotland's best asset, its people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Fiona Hislop to close for the Government. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank Bill Kidd for securing this debate and giving us the opportunity to reflect on the fantastic achievement of the first ever multi-sport European Championships event to be held and, of course, jointly hosted by Glasgow and Berlin this summer. Members who have contributed have paid tribute to all those who have made this happen. I want to add my voice to congratulate the athletes who took part in this thrilling competition in athletes. Duncan Scott in the pool, and obviously that great achievement by Laura Muir on the 1500 metres track. Thanks to all the officers and the delivery team of the 2018 European Championships, the local authorities, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Perth and Kinross, North Lanarkshire, Eastern Bartonshire, Stirlingshire, and of course Glasgow Life, Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park, and our own Scottish Government officials. And I want to put on record my thanks to Aileen Campbell, the former Sports Minister, for her contribution to this event. And of course, as we've heard, the amazing, committed 3,500 volunteers really brought energy and enthusiasm and welcome to the event. And everyone remarked what an impact they made, both to the professionalism of the event, but also the spirit of the championships. We should not underestimate what an innovation the European Championships were. This was the first ever multi-sport event on a European Championship level. And it was far from clear from the outset what the response would be. This was a bold and courageous step by everybody involved. Glasgow saw 88% of ticketing and attendance. Viewers in 10 major European markets saw a staggering 567 million hours of viewing. And the BBC alone reported 20 million viewers with a peak of 6.4 million. The Scottish Government was the main funder for this event in Glasgow in partnership with Glasgow City Council. But the vision of those involved in the various European sporting federations and the European Broadcasting Union themselves must be congratulated. We think our politics is tough, but imagine trying to bring 7 different governing bodies together to make sure that this happened. That was a major achievement itself. It was innovative as a concept. It was initially thought of some years ago, but it has effectively broken the mould of international championships. The intention is that this new multi-sport European Championship will now take place every 4 years between the Olympic competitions. Aquatics, athletics, cycling, gymnastics, rowing and triathlon federations came together with the addition of a golfing event. And the European federations I spoke to at the various events I attended were all very positive about the hosting and also the commitment of the Scottish Government ministers and the city leaders in their attendance and their support. And we were able to build on our relationships with Berlin following the opening of the Scottish Hub earlier this year, and the Championships has helped facilitate the Chamber of Commerce relationship between Glasgow and Berlin. And the Minister for Europe, Ben McPherson, attended events around the athletics in Berlin, and I was delighted to welcome the Berlin delegation to Scotland. So this new event has proven to be a huge success, a celebration of quality sport and athleticism with an outstanding cultural programme also, Festival 2018, which was enjoyed across Europe and beyond. And the event showcased our world-class venues, our capability to sustainably host sporting events based on existing and appropriate new infrastructure. The only entirely new venue was for BMX at Knightswood, and that new track, as Bill Kidd has outlined, is the only outdoor championships and Olympic standard track in Scotland. It will be home to Glasgow's Western Titans BMX Club, providing a lasting legacy for BMX in Scotland. It is truly world class, and I was told it's one of the few venues in the world that meets the latest competition regulations. So we should expect BMX champions from across the world to come and train in Scotland. Investment in the rowing tower at Strathclyde Country Park also equips this as a world-class venue, and hosting the event at venues across the country allowed us to spread the benefits to communities around Scotland. And of course, broadcasters believed in the concept from the start, and I think the way it was presented, some people said they didn't know quite what was in Berlin and what was happening in Glasgow, but it was very slick because it allowed the interchange and I think a very efficient and effective and entertaining programming. Images were beamed across the world and up to 12 hours per day of coverage on free-to-air channels, showcasing Scotland's unique culture and attractions alongside the sport. So we had backdrops of George Square, Loch Lomond, Strathclyde Country Park, together with golf from Glen Eagles and diving from Edinburgh. And it highlighted the very best of Scotland and added immeasurably to the profile and the reach of our new and hugely exciting Scotland is Now brand. And the championships weren't just about sport. That Festival 2018 highlighted Scotland's reputation for cultural brilliance and creativity. And the live orchestral link-up between the Royal Conservatoire and the musicians from Berlin's renowned arts university was a real highlight and a first for both institutions. Of course, we should also pay tribute to those that were involved in transport. A successful transport operation is critical for any event. 12 venues spread across Scotland, with over 8,500 athletes and officials accommodated in over 60 locations. Transport Scotland's knowledge and expertise was put to good effect, and good communications and planning were key. The Scottish Government is committed to ensuring a sustainable national legacy from hosting major events, and sustaining a flourishing, innovative and competitive events industry generates businesses, creates jobs and provides a legacy that benefits all of Scotland's communities. There are a range of things that I've covered today, but of course one of those aspects is highlighting Scotland as a dynamic, outward-looking and inclusive European nation. And the Scottish Government put a particular emphasis on using sporting legacy to increase physical activity levels. There should be no barrier to participating in sport or improving your health and lifestyle, whoever you are and whatever your background. So to support this, with Glasgow City Council, we invested £1 million to harness the profile of the championships. From this, Sports Scotland distributed £500,000 to community sports hubs. Spread right across Scotland, these hubs play an essential role in delivering grassroots sport and activity, which we know provides the foundation for a better health for all, as well as providing for future sporting success. £500,000 was invested at Glow Live at the Green, and this offered 11 days of free activity, and more than 120,000 people visited the site. So that venue was packed with sport, fitness, lifestyle education, opportunities and signposting in order to promote health and well-being. But looking forward, Presiding Officer, we must build on the triumph of these championships and look to the future. Next year, Scotland plays host to European short course swimming and European indoor athletics and, of course, the Solheim Cup. And the reputation Scotland has developed as a host of world-class events brings opportunities for international promotion and the business, of course, it brings to our economy. And we can't take that for granted. We constantly need to look for and plan for new events and opportunities. And that's a key role for our very respected organisation, Event Scotland, and I want to pay tribute to their role in the European Championships as well. It helps us promote our stunning landscapes, our exciting cities, the contribution of our young people, and of course our diverse communities. Our future events will look to use those world-class skills and expertise we have developed to build further. And of course, Presiding Officer, as Bill Kidd has said in his motion, With the 2018 European Championships, Glasgow and Berlin have set a high bar, and I hope everyone will join me in congratulating all those involved in developing and delivering this groundbreaking event.
Thank you. That concludes the debate, and I close this meeting.